I picked a random trail because I wanted to be alone and because I thought a simple day hike would clear my head. It was late fall, the kind of cold that does not bite yet but sits in your bones if you stop moving. The trailhead was barely marked, just a small wooden post with faded paint. There were no cars around, which felt fine at first. I liked the quiet. I liked the idea of walking where nothing expected anything from me. The forest was thick and heavy with damp smells. Wet leaves covered the ground, hiding rocks and roots. Every step made a soft crunch, and that sound followed me like it was stuck to my boots. The trees were tall and close together, blocking most of the sky. Light came through in thin gray lines, and everything else felt flat and dark. I checked my map once and put it back in my pocket. The trail was clear enough, just a narrow dirt line cutting through the leaves. As I walked deeper, the silence changed. At first, there were birds and wind moving branches. Then those sounds faded. It was not sudden, just slow, like someone turning a dial down. I became more aware of my own body. My breathing sounded too loud. My jacket rubbed when I moved my arms. I tried to slow down and match the quiet around me. After about an hour, I noticed something off about the trail. The ground looked disturbed in places, like leaves had been pushed aside recently. The dirt underneath was darker and wet. There were marks that did not look like animal tracks. They were long and uneven, as if something heavy had been dragged. I told myself it could be fallen branches or erosion from rain, but the marks followed the trail for a while, then disappeared, then came back again. The air started to smell wrong. Not rotten exactly, but sharp and sour, like old metal and wet fur. I felt it in the back of my throat. I stopped walking and listened. There was still no wind, no birds. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring down the trail, feeling like the forest was holding its breath with me. I kept going because turning around felt worse. The trail narrowed and dipped into a shallow valley. The ground stayed wet, and my boots sank a little with each step. I saw pieces of torn fabric caught on thorns, faded and stiff with dirt. They did not look old enough to be trash from years ago. Nearby, there were deep impressions in the mud, wider than a normal boot, pressed in at odd angles. Whatever made them moved without care for the path. My heart started to beat harder, not fast, just heavy. I felt watched, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way, like something was aware of me the same way I was aware of it. I tried to focus on normal details, the weight of my pack, the strap digging into my shoulder, the steady rhythm of walking. Then I heard movement behind me, not footsteps, not snapping branches, but a slow shift, like something large adjusting its weight. I did not turn right away. I kept walking and listened. The sound matched my pace for a few seconds, then stopped when I stopped. My mouth went dry. I felt heat rise into my face even though the air was cold. I finally turned around. The trail behind me was empty, just trees and leaves and the narrow line of dirt. But something was different. The leaves near the edge of the trail were pressed down, fresh and uneven. The smell was stronger now. I moved faster. The trail began to climb, winding between rocks. My legs burned, and my breath grew rough. I tripped once and caught myself on a tree, leaving dirt smeared on the bark. That was when I noticed scratches on the trunk, long and deep, running down at an angle too high for a normal animal. The wood underneath was pale and raw. The sense of being followed became constant. Even when I could not hear anything, I felt it. Every time I slowed, the forest felt closer, tighter. I stopped checking my map because my hands shook too much. I just focused on staying on the trail. Near the top of the climb, I found a small clearing. In the center was a pile of bones, stripped clean and scattered. Some were cracked open. Others were still dark at the ends, like they had not been there long. The smell was almost unbearable now. My stomach turned, and I fought the urge to panic. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. Running on a trail like that is never clean. I slipped, stumbled, slammed into branches. My breath came in sharp bursts, and my chest hurt. I could hear it now, crashing through brush, careless and fast. It did not move like a deer. It did not weave or dart. came straight through, breaking whatever was in the way. I pushed myself harder than I ever had. The trail blurred, but I recognized turns, slopes, landmarks I had passed before. The sound behind me stayed close, sometimes fading, sometimes rushing forward. At one point, I felt the ground shake with its steps. The forest began to thin, and light opened up ahead. I burst out of the trees into the area near the trailhead. I did not stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the door, hands numb and clumsy, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors and sat there shaking, listening. After a long minute, the sounds of the forest returned. Wind moved through branches. A bird called somewhere far off. Nothing came out of the trees. I drove away without looking back. Later, when I was home and safe, I checked local reports. I found mentions of hikers going missing in that area over the years. No clear answers, just warnings to stay on marked paths and hike in groups. I never went back to that trail. I still hike, but only in busy places, only where I can hear other people and cars in the distance. Sometimes, when the woods go quiet around me, I remember that heavy sound moving through brush, and I know some places do not care if you are ready or not. I planned the hike without much thought because it was supposed to be random and simple, just a long walk to clear my head. I picked a trail that did not get much traffic, one that cut through deep forest and climbed into rough hills. The weather looked calm that morning, gray but steady, the kind of day where the air feels heavy and quiet. I parked my car near a faded trail sign and started walking before sunrise, thinking the early start would give me more daylight later. The forest smelled wet and old, like rotting leaves and cold soil. Every step felt loud even though I was trying to move slow. The trail started wide but slowly narrowed. Trees leaned close together, their branches crossing over the path and blocking most of the sky. The ground was soft and uneven, full of roots and rocks hidden under leaves. I kept my eyes down most of the time, watching my footing, listening to my breathing and the sound of my boots pressing into dirt. Birds moved above me, but the forest still felt empty, like I was the only thing inside it. That empty feeling stayed with me and made my chest feel tight. After a few hours, the trail markers became harder to spot. The paint on the trees was old and peeling, and sometimes I walked for long stretches without seeing one. I told myself it was normal for a trail like this, but I still checked my map more often than I needed to. The forest started to change as I climbed higher. The trees grew thinner, and the ground became rocky and steep. Wind pushed through the branches, making them rub together in slow, dry sounds that felt too close to my ears. I noticed footprints in the dirt that were not mine. They looked fresh, deeper than mine, and pointed in the same direction. At first, I did not care because this was still a public trail. But the longer I walked, the more those footprints bothered me. I never saw anyone, and the prints never faded or turned away. They stayed with me for miles, sometimes clear, sometimes half erased by rocks and leaves, but always there. The idea that someone was ahead of me, moving at the same pace, started to settle in my mind. The sky darkened earlier than I expected. Thick clouds rolled in, and the light faded until the forest looked flat and dull, like everything was covered in ash. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped fast. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving, trying to reach a higher clearing I remembered from the map. That clearing never came. The trail split into two narrow paths with no signs at all. Both looked the same, both disappearing into thick trees. I chose one without thinking too long, trusting my sense of direction. That was the moment I realized how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves. Just my own steps and my breath. I felt exposed, like the trees were watching me instead of sheltering me. The footprints were still there, deeper now, leading straight ahead. I slowed down, listening harder, trying to hear any sign of another person. There was nothing. The silence pressed against my ears and made my thoughts loud and scattered. The trail started going downhill into a narrow valley. The ground was muddy, and water trickled between rocks. My boots slipped more than once, and I had to catch myself on tree trunks. The smell of wet earth grew stronger, almost sharp. I felt tired in a deep way, not just in my legs but in my head. I checked my map again and realized I had drifted far off the main trail. The lines and symbols did not match what I saw around me. Panic came slowly, like cold water seeping into my clothes. I turned around to head back, but the path behind me did not look the same. The trees felt closer, and the ground looked different, like the forest had shifted while I was not paying attention. The footprints were still there, but now they pointed both ways, overlapping and confusing. My heart started to pound, and sweat ran down my back despite the cold. I forced myself to keep moving, choosing a direction and sticking to it, telling myself that stopping would only make things worse. As daylight faded, the forest grew darker and heavier. Shadows filled every space between the trees. I heard movement off the trail, slow and steady, matching my pace. Each time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something smaller, but the rhythm felt wrong. It followed too closely and too carefully. My muscles stayed tense, ready to run, but there was nowhere clear to go. The ground leveled out near a dry creek bed. I stepped into it and followed the rocky path, hoping it would lead me out or at least give me a clear direction. The creek twisted through the valley, its banks steep and lined with sharp stones. My legs ached, and my throat felt dry and tight. I slipped on wet rock and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. The pain was sharp and real, grounding me in a way nothing else had. When I stood up, I saw the shape ahead of me. It was not clear, just a darker patch of darkness between the trees, but it was tall and still. It did not move. I froze, every part of me focused on that shape. The silence stretched out until my ears rang. Then the shape shifted slightly, enough to tell me it was a person standing there, watching, not hiding, not approaching, just waiting. Fear took over in a clean, sharp way. I turned and ran along the creek bed, my boots slipping and splashing, my lungs burning. Branches scratched my face and arms as I pushed through low growth. I did not look back. I ran until my legs shook and my vision blurred. The sound of movement followed me for a while, then slowly faded, leaving only my own rough breathing. The creek led me to a wider path, one I recognized from the map. Relief hit me so hard I had to stop and bend over, hands on my knees, trying not to throw up. I followed that path without stopping, even as darkness fully settled in. The forest no longer felt endless. It felt like something I was escaping. Hours later, I reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting in the dark. The sight of it felt unreal, like something from another life. I got inside and locked the doors, sitting there in silence until my hands stopped shaking. On the drive home, I kept seeing that still shape in my mind, standing in the trees, patient and quiet. I never went back to that trail. I cleaned my cuts and bruises, but the deeper marks stayed in my head. The forest did not feel wild or peaceful anymore. It felt careful and watchful, full of things that did not need to chase you to make you afraid. I learned that day how easy it is to vanish just a few steps off a path, and how thin the line is between a simple hike and something you do not come back from. I set out early in the morning, the sky still a pale gray from the dawn light, determined to hike a remote trail I'd heard about but never tried before. The forest was dense and thick with trees that stretched high and tight, their branches intertwining in a way that let very little sunlight through. The ground beneath my boots was soft with fallen leaves and damp earth, and every step I took made the smell of wet pine and moss stronger. The air was cool and fresh, with a hint of rain still lingering from the night before. I carried a pack with the usual water, some food, a map, compass, and a small first aid kit. I didn't expect any trouble, but I always prepared just in case. The trail was narrow and winding, and after the first hour, I noticed that the path got less worn, as if fewer people passed this way. The trees grew even closer, and the bushes along the trail were thick, making it harder to see very far ahead. I kept walking, the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves breaking the quiet of the forest. There was no sound of other hikers or animals nearby, just the occasional bird call and the distant rustle of leaves. I liked the silence. It made me feel alone but peaceful. After about 3 hours, I stopped at a small clearing to rest and drink some water. The clearing was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, surrounded by old trees with thick trunks. I sat on a fallen log, took out my map, and checked my location. According to the map, I was close to the old ridge, a spot known for great views, but also for being a little tricky to navigate. The trail was supposed to climb steeply there, and I felt a mixture of excitement and caution. I packed up and headed toward the ridge, following the faint path marked on my map. The climb was harder than I expected. The soil was loose and the rocks slippery from the moisture. I had to grab roots and branches to keep my balance, my heart beating faster with the effort. The trees thinned as I climbed, and the air got colder and sharper. I could see the tops of the forest stretching out below me, a sea of green that looked calm from this height. I reached the ridge near noon, the wind blowing hard and cold. I paused to catch my breath and look around. The view was amazing, but something felt off. I noticed a strange pattern in the ground. There were several areas where the earth looked disturbed, like something had been dug up and left open. No footprints, no signs of animals, just rough holes scattered across the ridge. I stared at them, feeling uneasy. I didn't know what had made those holes, but they didn't look natural. The wind seemed to carry a faint metallic smell, like rust or old iron. I packed up quickly, deciding it was better not to stay long in one place. I took a different route down, trying to stick to what looked like a safer path. The forest grew darker as the day went on, the thick canopy blocking more light. I noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no wind through the leaves, nothing but the sound of my breathing and footsteps. That silence felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My skin crawled, and I kept glancing around, waiting for something to appear. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible at first, standing among the trees just off the trail. It didn't move or make a sound. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't a person in the usual sense. Its posture was wrong, stiff and unnatural. It had no clear face, just a dark shape against the trunks. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. I told myself to keep going, to not let fear take hold. But the feeling didn't leave me. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of something watching me from the shadows, shapes that looked like people but never fully appeared. I quickened my pace, scanning the woods, my hands shaking slightly. I tried to stay calm and focused on the path, but my eyes kept darting to the dark spaces between the trees. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail disappeared. I realized I must have missed a turn somewhere, or maybe the path had been washed away by rain. I pulled out my map again, but the thick trees made it hard to get my bearings. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I didn't have a flashlight. My heart was pounding, and I felt panic rising. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked different. The strange holes on the ridge were nowhere in sight, replaced by a dense tangle of branches and undergrowth. The quiet was suffocating. I heard something moving nearby, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but no animal calls. I stopped and listened. The sound was slow and deliberate, like footsteps following me, but I didn't dare look back. My mind raced through possibilities, none comforting. I kept moving, trying to find the main trail. The forest felt endless and unfamiliar. I began to realize that I might be lost for real. The sun was almost gone, and shadows stretched long and thick. I stopped to catch my breath, my chest tight and heavy. My hands were cold, and sweat mixed with the dirt on my face. I reached into my pack for my phone, but no signal. I was completely alone out here. As night fell, the forest changed. The dark closed in around me like a wall. The strange noises grew closer and sharper. Snaps, rustles, and low sounds I couldn't identify. My mind screamed at me to move faster, but my legs were heavy and tired. I felt like something was stalking me, just out of sight but close enough to hear. I didn't want to imagine what it could be. I finally saw a faint glow through the trees, a light. It was small and flickering, like a campfire or a lantern. Hope surged through me. I headed toward it, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. When I got closer, I saw a small clearing with an old cabin. The light was from a candle in the window. The cabin looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows, but it was shelter. I went inside quietly, the floor creaking under my boots. The air was cold and smelled of damp wood. I found some matches and lit a candle I found on a dusty table. I sat down, trying to calm my shaking hands. Outside, the noises continued but seemed to stay away from the cabin. I locked the door and blocked it with a chair. I stayed there all night, listening to the sounds outside, wondering what had been following me. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left the cabin, moving carefully toward what I hoped was the way out. The forest was still thick, but with daylight I could see better. After hours of walking, I found a dirt road and then a trail that led back to my car. That day, I learned how easy it is to get lost in a forest, how quickly fear grows when you realize you're truly alone and something is watching. The strange holes on the ridge, the quiet that swallowed the birds, the unseen presence stalking me. It was real and terrifying. I didn't see what it was, and I never want to, but I know now to respect the wild, to stay on the trail, and never underestimate how dangerous being lost can be. That hike was the closest I ever came to pure fear, and it's a feeling I'll never forget. I picked a random trail because I wanted to be alone and not think. It was late fall, the kind of season where the air smells clean but cold, and the ground stays damp all day. The trail was not famous or marked well online. It was just a thin line on a map that cut through a wide stretch of forest and climbed into low mountains. I parked on the side of a dirt road, locked my car, and started walking before the sun was fully up. The light was gray and weak, and the trees looked tall and close together, like they were leaning in. At first, everything felt normal. My boots sank a little into the wet dirt. Fallen leaves stuck to the sides of my shoes. I could hear birds far away and the steady sound of wind moving through branches. The trail was narrow and uneven, with roots crossing it like veins. I kept a steady pace, breathing slow, feeling my legs warm up. I checked my watch and my map often, even though the trail was simple. I wanted to make sure I stayed on it. After about an hour, the forest started to feel different. The trees grew closer together, and the ground dropped off sharply on one side. The trail curved and climbed, and the air felt colder. The wind picked up and carried a sharp smell, like old metal and wet stone. I noticed something on the ground that made me stop. There were fresh boot prints in the mud, not old and washed out, but deep and clear. They were not mine. They were larger than my boots and pointed in the same direction I was going. I told myself it was nothing. People hike here sometimes. Still, the prints stayed in my head as I kept walking. I became more aware of every sound. A branch snapping made my shoulders tighten. The wind moving leaves sounded heavier, like footsteps when I was not looking. I tried to calm down and focus on the trail. The climb grew steeper, and sweat soaked into my shirt under my jacket. The trail crossed a small stream, barely more than water slipping over rocks. I stepped carefully and made it across without getting wet. On the other side, the ground flattened for a while, and the trees opened just enough to let in more light. I thought about turning back, but I felt stubborn. I had come out here to finish something, even if I did not know what that something was. Not long after that, I found something else that did not belong. A broken hiking pole lay off the trail, half buried in leaves. It was snapped clean in two, not worn down by time. The strap was torn, and the plastic handle was cracked. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. My chest felt tight. I did not touch it. I just stepped around it and kept going, telling myself someone must have fallen and dropped it. The forest grew quieter the higher I went. The birds stopped making noise. Even the wind felt weaker, trapped by the trees. I started to notice that the trail markings were fading. Some of the paint on trees was old and hard to see. I checked my map again and slowed down. I did not want to miss a turn. That was when I heard something behind me. It was soft at first, like leaves shifting. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing moved. I told myself it was an animal and kept going, but I could feel my heart beating harder now. Every few steps, I looked back. The trail behind me was empty, just trees and shadow. As the day went on, clouds rolled in and blocked the sun. The light faded faster than I expected. The temperature dropped, and my hands started to feel stiff. I realized I had misjudged the time. I was higher up than I planned to be, and the trail ahead looked rougher. Rocks replaced dirt, and the path narrowed even more. I slipped on a wet stone and fell hard on my side. Pain shot through my hip and down my leg. I lay there for a moment, breathing fast, waiting for the pain to settle. When I stood up, I could walk, but it hurt. I knew then that turning back would be slower than going forward, but going forward meant unknown ground. I chose to keep moving one careful step at a time. Not long after I started again, I noticed the boot prints once more. They were closer together now, as if whoever made them was moving slower, or maybe waiting. My mouth felt dry. I kept my head down and focused on the trail, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I felt it on my neck, like cold fingers. The forest closed in again, darker and thicker than before. The trail dipped into a shallow valley, and the air felt damp and heavy. I smelled rot, like old leaves and stagnant water. My foot sank into mud, and I almost lost my balance. I caught myself on a tree and felt the rough bark scrape my palm. That was when I saw movement ahead. Not clear, just a shape shifting behind trees. It was too slow to be an animal running and too steady to be branches moving in the wind. I froze, my muscles tight, my mind racing. The shape moved again, closer to the trail, then stopped. I could not see a face or details, just a dark outline. Fear settled deep in my stomach, heavy and cold. I did not shout or run. I slowly stepped back, keeping my eyes forward. The shape did not move. I turned and started walking fast the way I came, ignoring the pain in my leg. Every step felt loud. Leaves crunched under my boots. My breathing sounded too strong in my ears. The trail back seemed longer and steeper. My leg hurt more with each step. I slipped again but stayed on my feet. Behind me I heard the sound again, clearer now. Footsteps, slow and steady, matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. I pushed myself harder, panic burning through the pain. My lungs burned. My leg felt weak, like it might give out. The light faded more, and shadows stretched across the trail. I could barely see the markings now. I missed a turn and ended up on a narrow path that dropped sharply downhill. I realized too late that it was not the main trail. I slid down the slope, grabbing at branches and rocks. I scraped my arms and tore my jacket. I landed hard at the bottom, knocking the air out of my chest. For a moment, I could not breathe. When I finally did, it came out in a painful gasp. I lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped above me. I waited, my whole body shaking. Minutes passed. No sound came from the slope. I forced myself to move, dragging my body into thick brush away from the base of the hill. I stayed low and quiet, crawling until my muscles screamed. Time stretched in that dark space. The forest was almost silent. I could hear my own heartbeat and the faint drip of water somewhere nearby. I stayed there until the sky began to lighten again, not with sunrise, but with the moon pushing through thin clouds. The cold sank into my bones, but fear kept me awake. When I finally moved again, it was slow and careful. I followed the sound of water downhill, knowing streams often led to roads. My leg throbbed, and my hands were numb. I slipped and stumbled, but I kept going. Hours later, I broke out of the trees near a gravel road. My car was nowhere in sight, but the road meant safety. I walked until my legs could not carry me anymore. A passing truck found me just before dawn. I made it home after that, bruised, scraped, and exhausted. I never went back to that trail. I still hike, but I stick to busy paths now, places where people are close and the woods do not feel so empty. What followed me that day never showed its face, but I know it was real because the fear stayed long after the forest was gone. I picked a random trail because I wanted to be alone and because I trusted the map more than my own instincts. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the air feels clean but sharp, and every breath reminds you that the day will not last long. The trailhead parking area was empty when I arrived. No other cars, no footprints that looked fresh, just damp dirt and fallen leaves pressed flat by earlier rain. That should have been the first warning, but I ignored it. I had hiked alone many times before, and nothing bad had ever happened to me. That false confidence sat heavy on my shoulders as I locked my car and started walking. The trail went uphill almost right away. Tall trees closed in on both sides, blocking most of the light. The ground was uneven, covered with roots that twisted like veins across the path. I focused on my steps, listening to the sound of my boots crunching through leaves. Every now and then, a bird took off from somewhere nearby, the sudden movement making my chest tighten for no good reason. I told myself it was normal. This was the woods. Sounds happened. After about an hour, the trail became harder to follow. The markings on the trees were faded, and fallen branches covered parts of the path. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The map still showed the trail clearly, though, and I trusted it. I kept going, pushing deeper into the forest. The air felt colder, heavier, and I noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds, no wind, just my breathing and the soft sound of my steps. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were not animal tracks. They were boot prints pressed deep into the mud, going in the same direction as me. At first, I felt relieved. Someone else had been here recently. Then I realized something felt off. The prints were uneven, like the person had been dragging one foot. Some steps were far apart, others close together, as if they had stopped often. I followed them without really thinking about it, my mind already trying to explain them away. Maybe someone was injured, maybe a hunter, maybe another hiker who got tired. The deeper I went, the worse the trail became. Trees grew closer together, their branches low and tangled. I had to push through thick brush, feeling it scrape against my arms and jacket. The footprints continued, always ahead of me, always just fresh enough to stand out. I started to feel watched, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, constant way that made my skin crawl. I kept turning my head, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The light began to change. The sun was dropping faster than I expected, and long shadows stretched across the ground. I checked the time and felt a rush of panic. I had planned this hike poorly. Turning back felt like the smart move, but the trail behind me already looked different, less clear than before. Leaves had shifted, and the forest seemed to rearrange itself when I wasn't looking. I hesitated, then kept moving forward, telling myself I would find a clearing or a loop back soon. That was when I smelled something wrong. It was a strong, sour smell, like rot mixed with damp earth. It grew stronger with every step. My stomach tightened, and I slowed down, moving carefully now. The footprints led toward a small clearing where the trees thinned out. In the center was an old campsite. A collapsed tent frame lay half buried in leaves. Rusted cans were scattered around, and a fire pit sat cold and black. Everything looked abandoned, but not old enough to feel forgotten. Felt recent, like someone had left in a hurry. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw a backpack. One strap was torn, and the fabric was stained dark. I did not touch it. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The forest felt closer now, like it was leaning in. The smell was strongest here, and I understood what it meant without wanting to. I felt a deep fear then, the kind that sinks into your bones. I realized I was not supposed to be here. Whatever had happened, it was not something I wanted to be part of. I turned around, my heart pounding, and tried to go back the way I came. But the trail was gone. The clearing looked different from this angle, and the trees blended together into a wall of dark trunks and branches. I moved fast, then faster, pushing through brush, slipping on wet leaves. My breathing became loud and uneven. I kept thinking I heard movement behind me, not footsteps exactly, but the sound of branches shifting, leaves being disturbed. I did not turn around. I focused on moving forward, on finding any sign of the trail, any familiar mark. The ground sloped downward and I nearly fell more than once. My legs burned and my lungs ached. The light was almost gone now, the forest sinking into gray and black. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to slow down, to think. I followed the slope, hoping it would lead to water or a road or anything that made sense. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. Felt unreal, like stepping out of a nightmare. I stood there for a moment, bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The road was empty, but it was real, solid, safe. I followed it, walking until my legs felt numb, until I saw my car parked far ahead, exactly where I had left it. I reached the car just as the last light disappeared. I got inside and locked the doors without thinking. My hands shook as I started the engine. I sat there for a long time before driving away, staring at the dark tree line, half expecting to see something move. I never went back to that trail. A few weeks later, I searched online and found a short news article about a missing hiker in that area. There were no details, no follow-up, just a name and a date that matched the time the campsite would have been used. I closed the page and did not read any more. The ending was clear to me, even if it was never written down anywhere. I walked into something I did not understand and barely walked back out. The forest did not chase me. It did not need to. It simply showed me how small and unprepared I was, and it let me leave. That was enough to make sure I never forgot it. I went hiking alone on a random weekday because I needed to get away from everything. Nothing special pushed me to choose that trail. I picked it off a map the night before, one of those long loops that people rarely talk about. It sat deep in a national forest, far from main roads. I packed simple gear, enough water, some food, a headlamp, and a small first aid kit. The weather looked calm, and the trail description said it was moderate. I had done harder hikes before, so I didn't think much about it. The trailhead was empty when I arrived early in the morning. The parking lot was gravel, uneven, and surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the light. The air smelled wet and cold, even though it hadn't rained. I locked my car and stood there for a moment, listening. No wind, no birds, just a deep quiet that felt heavy. I brushed it off and started walking. The trail was narrow, covered in pine needles and small rocks. Trees grew close together, their branches crossing over the path like a loose roof. The deeper I went, the darker it became, even though the sun was rising somewhere above the canopy. My boots made a soft crunching sound that felt too loud. Every few minutes I stopped without meaning to, just to listen. Each time there was nothing. After a couple of hours, the trail became harder to follow. The ground dipped and rose, cutting through thick brush. Some trail markers were old and faded, barely visible on trees. I noticed broken branches near the path, snapped at odd angles. At first, I thought it was just animals, but the more I walked, the more frequent it became. Some branches were thick, not the kind that break easily. I kept going because turning back felt like giving in to nerves. My legs felt strong, and I wasn't tired yet. Still, a strange pressure settled in my chest, like being watched without seeing anyone. I told myself it was just isolation messing with my head. Around midday, I reached a long stretch where the trail ran alongside a shallow ravine. The drop wasn't steep, but it was filled with rocks and fallen trees. The smell changed there. It was sharp and sour, mixed with damp earth. I slowed down and scanned the area. That was when I noticed footprints. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different, deeper in some spots, lighter in others, like someone was walking unevenly. The prints followed the trail in the same direction I was heading. They looked fresh. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them, trying to decide what that meant. Other hikers used this trail sometimes, I told myself. Still, I hadn't seen a single car at the trailhead. As I moved on, the forest grew quieter. No insects, no birds. Even my footsteps sounded dull, like the ground was swallowing the noise. I became very aware of my breathing and the sound of my gear shifting with each step. Every few minutes, I felt the urge to look back. When I did, the trail always looked empty, stretching behind me like nothing had ever touched it. Later, I noticed something else. Small piles of stones stacked near the trail, not tall, just 3 or 4 rocks placed carefully. They appeared every so often, never far from the path. I knew people sometimes did that, but these were too consistent, too deliberate. Some of the stones were heavy, not easy to move without effort. My pace picked up without me deciding to do it. My thoughts narrowed down to simple things. Step, breathe, watch. Sweat ran down my back even though the air stayed cool. The forest felt tighter, like the trees leaned inward the farther I went. Then I heard movement off the trail. Not an animal crashing through brush, but slow shifting sounds, like someone moving carefully. It stopped when I stopped. When I walked, it followed, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see anything. I kept my eyes forward and focused on the trail, afraid that if I looked too long into the trees, I would see something I couldn't forget. The map said the loop would curve back toward the trailhead after a ridge ahead. I told myself I just had to reach that point. My legs started to ache, not from distance but from tension. My grip on my trekking pole tightened until my hand hurt. When I reached the ridge, relief hit me hard. The land dropped away on the other side, opening up enough to let sunlight through. The trail widened, and for a moment, I felt exposed instead of trapped. I stopped to drink water and calm my breathing. That was when I noticed the footprints again, clearer now in the softer dirt. They curved off the trail and then came back, as if whoever made them had stepped aside to wait. Something inside me shifted then. Not panic, but a cold understanding that I needed to leave. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. I turned around and started heading back the way I came, faster than before. The sounds in the forest changed immediately. The careful movement returned, closer now. Twigs snapped behind me, always staying out of sight. I didn't run, because I knew that would make things worse. I walked fast, steady, forcing my breathing to stay even. Time stretched in a strange way. The trail felt longer than before, every turn unfamiliar. The stone piles looked different now, some knocked over, some missing. The broken branches seemed closer to the path, like the forest was closing ranks. My legs burned by the time I finally saw the parking lot through the trees. Relief washed over me so hard I almost stumbled. The forest noise returned all at once, birds calling, wind moving through leaves, like a switch had been flipped. I reached my car, unlocked it, and got inside. I didn't sit there long. I drove away without stopping, gravel spitting under my tires as I left the trailhead behind. Later, when I was safe and far from that place, I checked my gear. Mud covered the back of my boots more than the front, like I had been followed closely for a long time. I washed everything and tried to forget it. I never went back to that trail. I don't tell myself stories about what happened out there. I don't need to. Something real followed me through that forest. Something human and careful enough to stay hidden. The clear ending for me is simple. I made it out because I left when I did. If I had stayed longer or ignored that feeling one more time, I know I wouldn't be writing this now. I went hiking alone on a random weekday because I needed space and quiet. I picked a trail I had never walked before, far from the popular parks, one of those long forest routes that barely shows up on maps. The drive there already felt wrong. The road narrowed until my tires brushed loose gravel and weeds. There were no other cars, no signs, and no cell signal. I parked near a rusted gate and a faded trail marker nailed crooked to a tree. The air smelled wet and old, like leaves that had been rotting for years. I tightened my boots, checked my pack, and stepped onto the trail without thinking too much about it. At first, the hike felt normal. The ground was soft from rain days ago, and my boots left clear prints in the mud. Tall trees blocked most of the sky, and the light came down in dull gray patches. The forest was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like sound had trouble moving. I kept walking, focusing on my breathing and the steady rhythm of my steps. After about an hour, the trail started to fade. The dirt path broke into scattered footprints and bent grass. I told myself this was still the trail, just less used, and I kept going. The deeper I went, the more off the place felt. Birds stopped making noise. There was no wind, but branches kept swaying slightly, like something heavy had passed through earlier. I noticed old trash pushed off to the side of the path. Rusted cans, torn plastic, pieces of rope. None of it looked recent, but it also did not look like random litter. It looked placed. I felt my stomach tighten, but I ignored it and kept moving. I checked my watch and realized more time had passed than I thought. The forest seemed the same in every direction. Trees packed close together, the ground uneven and slick. Then I noticed something that made me stop. My own footprints crossed the path ahead of me. I stood there staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I had not turned around. I was sure of that. But the prints were mine, same tread, same length. They disappeared into thicker brush on the left. I felt a slow cold spread across my back. I decided to turn around. As soon as I did, the forest felt different. Every step back felt harder, like the ground pulled at my feet. I started paying attention to small sounds. Leaves shifting, a branch snapping far away. Nothing clear, nothing close enough to point at, but enough to keep my nerves tight. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer, maybe nothing. Still, I kept glancing behind me. The trail was harder to find going back. What I thought was the path before now looked like random forest floor. The light dimmed as clouds thickened overhead. I walked faster, then stopped when I saw something hanging from a tree. It was a strip of cloth, dirty and frayed, tied in a knot at eye level. I knew I had not passed it earlier. It was not a normal trail marker. It felt like a sign meant for someone specific. I felt watched for the first time, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way, like eyes that had been there the whole time. I forced myself to keep moving. My breathing got louder in my ears. I stepped over fallen logs and pushed through thorny brush. At one point, I slipped on wet leaves and scraped my leg on a sharp rock. The pain grounded me for a second, but it also reminded me how alone I was. I wrapped the cut and kept going, leaving small drops of blood behind me. Then I smelled something wrong. It was a thick, sour smell, like metal and rot mixed together. I followed it by accident and saw a small clearing ahead. In the center was an old campsite, not abandoned long ago. The ground was packed flat. There were food scraps, burned wood, and a tarp stretched low between trees. No one was there, but the place felt active, like someone had just stepped away. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision shake. That was when I heard footsteps that matched mine. Not rushed, not heavy, just steady. I moved and they moved. I stopped, and after a moment they stopped too. I did not turn around. I just stood there, feeling sweat run down my sides despite the cold air. I started walking again, faster this time, and the steps followed at the same distance. Branches cracked behind me, leaves shifted. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly. I broke into a run. The forest blurred around me. My lungs burned, and my pack bounced painfully against my back. I did not care where I was going anymore. I just needed distance. I tripped more than once, catching myself on trees, tearing my sleeves. The footsteps stayed with me, never gaining, never falling behind. That was the worst part. Felt controlled. Eventually, the ground sloped downward, and I heard water. A river came into view, wide and fast, blocking my path. I stopped at the bank, gasping for air. I turned just enough to see movement between the trees. A shape, tall, human, standing still. I could not see details, just the outline. It did not chase me to the water. It just waited. I realized then that the trailhead gate was downstream. I remembered crossing a shallow section earlier in the day. I stepped into the river without thinking, the cold shocking my legs numb. The current pushed hard, almost knocking me over, but I fought across, using rocks to steady myself. My boots filled with water, and my legs ached, but I made it to the other side and kept moving. I followed the river until the trees thinned and the land opened up. When I finally saw the rusted gate and my car beyond it, I felt my knees almost give out. I did not stop until I was inside the car with the doors locked. I sat there shaking, watching the tree line. Nothing came out. No one followed. I drove away as fast as the road allowed. When I reached a place with signal, I pulled over and sat in silence for a long time. I checked my gear later and noticed something I did not remember packing. A short length of dirty rope tangled at the bottom of my bag. I threw it away at the next stop and never went back to that trail. The ending stayed clear in my mind because I made it out alive, but the fear did not stay in the woods. It followed me home in smaller ways. I stopped hiking alone. I stopped trusting empty trails. That day taught me that the scariest things do not need to run or speak or show their face. Sometimes they just walk behind you and wait for the right moment. And sometimes the only reason you survive is because you move before they decide to. I had taken many hikes in my life, but the one that still sits heavy in my chest happened on a cold late autumn afternoon in a place I barely even chose. It was random, almost careless. I had been driving for hours through a dull stretch of countryside, my head full of noise from work and stress, and when I saw a small wooden sign pointing to a trail, I pulled over without thinking. I just wanted to walk somewhere quiet and breathe real air. That simple impulse is what pushed me into the most frightening few hours I've ever lived through. The trail started from a small dirt parking patch with only one other car sitting there, coated in dust like it had been abandoned long before I arrived. There were no people around, no sound except the wind running through bare branches and the faint ticking from my cooling engine. The air had that dry, cold smell that tells you daylight won't last much longer. I zipped my jacket up and stepped onto the path, telling myself I'd stay close and not go too deep. But the trail looked peaceful, almost too inviting, with tall pines forming a dark green tunnel over the narrow dirt path. At first the walk felt calming. The ground was soft under my boots, covered in old needles and a thin layer of frost. My breath came out in white clouds that hung in front of me before fading away. I liked the feeling of being away from everything, hearing only my footsteps and the rustling of branches above me. But after 20 or 30 minutes, I started to feel a strange awareness, like the woods were slowly closing in. The trail became tighter, the trees growing closer together, their trunks darker, shadows thicker. I kept going, telling myself it was just the lack of sunlight. After a while, I noticed something odd. The sound of the forest seemed different. There were no birds, no small animals hustling through the brush, no distant insects. Just the steady scrape of my boots and the wind pushing through the canopy. The deeper I went, the stronger the silence felt. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin tighten. I decided I would turn around soon, but when I checked the time on my phone, I realized how fast the day was slipping away. The sky between the branches had shifted into a pale gray. I stopped walking for a moment to listen. That was when I heard it. Something faint, something that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. It was a soft crunch, like weight shifting on dry leaves. Came from somewhere behind me. I stood still, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a branch falling. But the steps didn't sound random. They sounded timed, slow, heavy enough that they didn't match any small animal. When I turned around, I saw nothing but the trail stretching back through the trees, empty and still. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I forced myself to breathe normally and started walking again, but now every few steps I would hear that sound behind me. Soft crunches, then quiet, then another one. I didn't want to run because running feels like an announcement of fear, but my pace picked up without me deciding. The trail curved slightly to the right, and when I reached that bend, I glanced back again. Again, nothing, and yet the feeling of being followed pressed harder, like a hand on the back of my neck. The worst part was when I realized the ground ahead looked unfamiliar. I had been following a narrow marked path earlier. Now the markers were gone. I checked the trees around me and saw nothing but rough bark and moss. I slowed down and tried to remember if the trail had split somewhere, but I couldn't. It felt impossible, like I had walked into a different forest without noticing. For a few minutes I kept moving forward, hoping the trail would appear again. Then I heard a new sound, a dry snapping sound, sharper than the quiet footsteps before. came from my left, deeper in the trees. I froze instantly. The snapping sound repeated again, closer this time, followed by the rustle of something large brushing against branches. I stepped back, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but the way the brush moved, I knew something big was there. I didn't know if it was an animal or a person, but either one was bad news. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone when I pulled it out. Of course, there was no signal, only one tiny bar that flickered and vanished again. The battery was low too, only 18%. I turned around and started moving the way I thought the trail had been, but the forest felt twisted, like everything looked the same no matter which direction I faced. Every tree looked like the last. My shoulders were tense, my breathing tight, and every few seconds I heard movement somewhere behind me. Slow, steady, deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal wandering. It sounded like something pacing itself with my steps. I kept walking for what felt like half an hour, though it was probably much less. The sky had gone a darker shade of gray, and the cold started cutting through my jacket. My hands felt numb. The fear kept growing, piling up inside my stomach until every sound felt like a warning. I finally saw something that gave me hope. An old wooden post sticking out of the ground. It looked like it used to hold a trail marker, but the paint had faded off. Still, it meant I was close to the real path again. I moved faster toward it, checking behind me every few seconds. The forest was darker now, but I saw something move. Not clearly, just a shift in the shadows. Something tall, human-sized, standing just behind a cluster of trees far down the path. When I blinked, the shape wasn't there anymore. My legs felt weak, but I pushed myself forward until the real trail returned under my boots. I recognized the ground. I recognized the split in the trees overhead. I felt a rush of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I kept following the path, moving as fast as I could without running. The woods behind me stayed silent for a few minutes, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then I heard it again, the slow, heavy crunch of footsteps on leaves. Closer now, closer than before. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. I knew something was following me, and I knew it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I kept my eyes fixed forward and followed the trail until the trees began to open up. I saw the faint outline of the parking patch through the branches. When I stepped out of the tree line, the cold air hit me harder, but it felt cleaner, safer. I could see my car sitting alone. The other dusty car was still there, unmoved, windows fogged over from the cold. I didn't dare look behind me again. I unlocked my car, climbed inside, and shut the door with shaking hands. I hit the lock button twice just to be sure. I sat there for a few seconds trying to slow my breathing. The forest edge looked calm from the inside of the car, almost harmless. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had followed me. When I started the engine and pulled away, I kept my eyes on the mirror even though the fading light made it hard to see anything clearly. As I drove down the empty road, I finally let myself breathe normally again. But I didn't stop watching the tree line until it disappeared behind me. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe that's the part that keeps replaying in my mind. It wasn't a ghost or anything impossible. It was something real, something with weight, something that walked like a person. And what scares me most is knowing that if I had taken a wrong step, if I had walked a little slower, if the daylight had faded just a bit sooner, I don't think I would have made it back to the trail at all. I started the hike early in the morning, before the sun had climbed over the hills, because I wanted to cover as many miles as possible before the heat set in. I picked a random trail I had never tried before, a long and quiet route that cut through a national forest that people rarely talked about. The map made it look simple, just a long loop with one main path and a few small side trails. I wanted silence, distance, and a place where my head could slow down. I thought an empty trail was the right choice, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I realized how different it felt when there wasn't a single human sound anywhere. No cars, no voices, nothing but trees pressing in on every side. The first few miles were easy. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled like sap and cold dirt. The forest felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like everything was watching. The deeper I went, the more the path narrowed. Branches scraped my shoulders. The light dimmed because the trees grew tighter together. I kept checking the map on my phone, but the signal dropped the moment I passed a ridge, and the screen froze. I told myself it didn't matter because the trail was marked, and I wasn't that far in. Around the 4th mile, I noticed small things that made me slow down. The prints on the ground didn't match what I usually saw on hiking trails. There were some that looked like boots, but they were old, half covered by dirt and leaves, and the pattern didn't match anything modern. Some prints were wider and deeper, like someone had walked through the area carrying a heavy load. I kept telling myself it was probably hunters or rangers, but something about the way the tracks overlapped made it feel like they weren't fresh, like someone had been there years ago but the ground still remembered it clearly. The forest was too quiet. Even the birds had fallen silent. At one point, the only sound was my own breathing and the slow crunch of leaves under my boots. Every time I stopped walking, the silence wrapped around me so tightly that I felt pressure in my ears. I tried to drink water to calm myself, but even the sound of the bottle cap felt too loud. I kept moving because standing still made me feel exposed. I tried to focus on small things like the smell of old wood, the way the wind pushed the treetops, the rough straps of my backpack digging into my shoulders. But the more details I noticed, the more I felt like I shouldn't be there. About an hour later, the trail split even though the map didn't show any fork. One way looked like the real path, wide and worn. The other looked newer, like something had pushed through the trees recently. The newer path had broken branches on the ground, deep marks in the dirt, and places where the soil was overturned. It didn't feel like something natural had done it. It looked like something heavy had been dragged. I decided to stay on the main trail, but even that didn't calm me down. I could still see the fresh marks out of the corner of my eye, and the back of my neck wouldn't stop prickling, like someone was standing behind me even though I knew no one was there. The next stretch felt endless. The trees grew thicker, and the path started to slope downward into a lower part of the forest where everything felt colder, even though the sun was out. My steps echoed strangely, like the ground was hollow underneath. I kept thinking I felt movement behind me. A branch snapping softly, leaves shifting, something brushing against bark. Every time I turned around, all I saw were trees standing close together like they were blocking the view on purpose. I tried to speed up, but the trail began twisting tighter, almost turning back on itself. Felt wrong, like the forest was swallowing the path. I stopped to check the map again even though I knew it wasn't loading. The empty screen just showed my frozen location from an hour ago, and that made my stomach drop because I thought I had moved far beyond that point. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my hands felt shaky, so I forced myself to breathe slower. I kept telling myself there was a road a few miles out from the loop. If I stayed calm and kept moving, I would reach it. But every time I walked forward, I heard something move behind me. Not fast, not loud, just a slow, steady shift of weight, like someone copying my steps with a small delay. I didn't run. Running felt like a mistake. Instead, I walked faster, almost pushing myself into a half jog. The forest around me changed again. The trees became older, wider, darker. Some trunks had deep scratches, long and uneven, like something had scraped them years ago. The ground dipped into dark patches where water had collected. I could smell something metallic in the air, mixed with the wet soil. When I reached another bend, I saw something that made my whole body stiffen. Off the trail, about 20 feet into the trees, there was a torn backpack slumped against a fallen log. It was faded from the sun, dirty, the straps frayed. It looked like it had been there a long time. There was no sign of a person around it. No clothing, no tools, nothing else. Just that backpack sitting there in a way that felt too deliberate, like someone had placed it to be seen. I didn't go near it. I didn't take a step off the trail. I just kept moving because I didn't want to know what was around it. For the next mile, I felt like something was pacing me. I could hear the weight of it moving through leaves. Slow, careful steps, like it didn't want to be seen but didn't mind being heard just enough to keep me on edge. My legs started to ache from how tense I was holding them. Sweat ran down my back even though the air felt cold. The trail finally began climbing upward again, and the higher I went, the weaker the sounds behind me became. But they never fully stopped. I forced myself to keep going until my lungs hurt, until the light began changing between the trees, turning from dim green to a brighter shade that told me I was moving out of the deeper part of the forest. Then, finally, I saw a sign of the main loop, an old wooden marker with a faded arrow carved into it. I had never been so relieved to see a piece of wood in my life. I kept walking until the trees opened up enough that sunlight warmed my face again, and the thick silence finally loosened its grip. By the time I reached the road, my legs felt unsteady, like I had been walking for days instead of hours. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. I locked the doors, sat there shaking, and waited until my breathing slowed. When I drove away, the forest looked normal again from the outside, quiet, green, and harmless. But I knew what it felt like inside. The weight of the silence, the strange tracks, the torn backpack, the steady sound of something matching my steps. I knew I had been watched the entire time. The ending was simple and clear. I made it out only because I kept moving. If I had stopped longer, if I had followed that new path, if I had gone near that backpack, I'm sure something would have gone very differently. I didn't see what was in the woods, but I didn't need to. Knowing it was there, staying just behind me with slow, heavy steps, was enough to tell me that I would never return to that trail again. I started the hike before sunrise because I liked having the trail to myself. The world felt different at that hour, quiet in a way that made every sound carry. I could hear my own boots pressing into the dirt, the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the cold air, and the quick breaths I let out as I pushed uphill. The sky was still dark, but I could see a thin gray line forming on the horizon. I thought it would be a normal hike, just something random to clear my mind after a long week. I wasn't expecting anything strange. I had done dozens of solo hikes before without a problem, and this trail wasn't known for anything dangerous. It looked like any other mountain trail. Narrow, packed dirt, patches of rocks, old pine trees leaning over it like they were tired of standing straight. As I kept climbing, the air changed. It became colder much faster than it usually did at that elevation. I didn't think too much about it at first. Weather in the mountains could shift fast, and I assumed that was all it was. But then I noticed something else. The forest felt too still. Even early in the morning, I should have heard at least a few birds or the soft rush of small animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, it felt like everything was holding its breath. My steps sounded too sharp, too loud. I slowed down a little without even realizing I was doing it. I reached a part of the trail where the trees tightened around me, their branches closing in like thin, crooked arms. The path narrowed, almost squeezing me, and I had to turn my body slightly to get through. As I moved deeper into that section, the silence pressed even harder against my ears. I checked the time on my watch and saw that it had been only an hour since I started, but it felt longer, like I had been walking through that quiet for half the day. Then I noticed tracks on the ground. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Large ones, deep in the dirt. Some were fresh, edges still sharp. Someone had walked through there not long before me. Normally I wouldn't care. People used the trail all the time. But there was something strange about these prints. They didn't follow the trail. They went straight into the trees, cutting through branches and bushes like the person didn't care where they stepped. It looked messy and rushed. I assumed maybe someone got lost or decided to explore off-trail. But something about the way the prints changed direction, doubled back, crossed over themselves again and again, bothered me. It looked like someone pacing or looping around with no clear purpose. I stepped over them and kept going. The trees opened up again and the trail widened. I felt slightly better, but the silence still followed me. Even the wind felt weak, like it didn't want to move too much. The sky brightened into a pale blue, but somehow the light didn't feel warm. It felt thin and washed out. Every now and then I turned my head, not because I heard anything, but because I felt something behind me. That slow, annoying feeling of being watched from a distance. I kept telling myself it was my mind playing tricks, but my body didn't believe it. My body stayed tight, uneasy, alert. After another hour, the trail reached a long wooden footbridge that stretched over a dry riverbed. I walked onto it slowly. The wood creaked under my boots in a way that echoed up the empty valley. As I reached the middle of the bridge, I stopped. Something caught my eye on the other side. A torn piece of dark fabric snagged on a cracked plank. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve. The edges were ripped, not cut clean. I bent down and picked it up. The fabric felt stiff, like it had been pulled harshly. For a moment I thought someone had been injured, but there were no blood stains, nothing else around it. Just that single torn piece. I dropped it and kept walking. I didn't want to think about it. Hiking alone could make small things feel bigger than they were, and I didn't want to turn a random piece of fabric into a story in my head. But as soon as I stepped off the bridge, I noticed more boot prints. Fresh again, pressed deep into the dirt. They were the same size as the ones earlier. Same pattern on the bottom. They weren't walking calmly along the trail. They zigzagged, stopped suddenly, turned sharply, then continued. It felt like I was following someone who didn't have a clear idea of where they were going or what they were doing. The uneasy feeling grew worse. I started paying attention to the forest around me, scanning the trees, checking shadows, watching for movement. Nothing moved, nothing breathed except me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there, moving when I wasn't looking, stopping whenever I stopped. The trail climbed steeply after that, winding up a rocky slope. As I climbed, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone coming up the path. But every time I looked, the trail was empty. The air was so still I could hear my heartbeat clearly. When I reached the top of the slope, the trail flattened out and opened into a small clearing. And that was when I saw something that made my entire body freeze cold. A backpack. Not thrown, not dropped, but placed carefully in the center of the clearing. Upright, perfectly balanced, like someone wanted it to be found. I stared at it for a long minute. The fabric was faded and dirty, but it didn't look like it had been there long. There were no leaves gathered around it. No dust settled on top. I walked closer slowly, keeping my eyes on the treeline. The zipper of the main pocket was halfway open. When I looked inside, I saw a crushed water bottle, an old map, and a single glove. Everything looked worn, like it belonged to someone who had been hiking for days. But what scared me wasn't what was inside the backpack. It was the footprints around it. They circled it again and again, like someone had walked around the clearing for hours, never leaving the area, never moving on. The dirt was disturbed in strange looping patterns, and the prints didn't lead away from the clearing. They just stopped, completely stopped, as if the person who made them had disappeared right there without walking out. My chest tightened. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, faster than before. My mind kept telling me there was someone out there, hiding, watching me move through their steps, through their space. I felt exposed. I kept my shoulders tight, expecting a sound behind me at any second. But there was nothing, not even a breeze. When I reached the footbridge again, I stopped. More prints had appeared. They weren't mine. They were fresh and pointed toward the direction I had just come from. Someone had walked onto the bridge after me, but I never heard anyone. The wood would have creaked. There was no way someone could cross that bridge quietly. Yet the prints were there, deep and clear. My stomach twisted. I didn't stop again after that. I moved downhill fast, almost jogging at times, not caring about the strain in my legs. The forest stayed silent the entire way, as if it was holding something back, as if it knew something I didn't. Every sound I made felt too loud, like it didn't belong there. The feeling of being watched stuck to me, growing heavier the closer I got to the trailhead. When I finally reached the parking area, my car was the only one there. The whole place felt abandoned. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and sat inside for a moment, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. As I started the engine and looked back at the trail one last time, I noticed something that made my blood go cold. A single boot print in the dirt right behind my car. Fresh, pointing toward me. The forest had been silent the entire time because someone else had been there with me. Not an animal, not something supernatural, just a person. A person who moved without sound, who wandered in circles, who left things behind like warnings or traps, who watched from trees or shadows where I never looked fast enough to see. I drove away without looking back again. Even now, I still think about how quiet that forest was, how those footprints kept appearing, how the backpack sat waiting in the clearing as if someone placed it there for the next person to find. I think about how close that person must have been the entire time, how they followed without making a sound, how they stopped when I stopped, how they stood behind my car long enough to leave a print before I noticed. And the part that stays with me the most is how nothing supernatural was needed to make it terrifying. All it took was another human being. Someone unpredictable, someone who moved in ways that didn't make sense, someone who never let me see them, but made sure I knew they were there. I never hiked that trail again. I never will. I didn't plan anything special for that hike. It was supposed to be a random weekend walk to clear my head. Nothing more. I picked a trail I'd never tried before, one that ran through a long stretch of dry forest and rocky hills. It wasn't a famous spot or some place people bragged about online. It was just a simple trail on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing anyone. That was the whole point. I wanted silence, space, and a break from everything that had been working on my nerves for weeks. The day started normal. The air was cool enough that my breath felt sharp in my chest. The path was narrow and uneven, covered with dry leaves that crushed under my boots. The trees around me were tall and thin, their branches tangled together like a net above my head. Nothing felt strange at first. I walked for about an hour, my backpack bouncing lightly, my legs warming up, my mind loosening little by little. I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from people, away from noise, just me and the forest. But slowly things shifted. Not in some supernatural way, nothing like that. Just a feeling in my stomach, the kind that tells you something is off even when everything around you looks normal. The first time I felt it was when I noticed how quiet the forest had become. Birds usually chirp everywhere in places like that, even during the middle of the day. But there was nothing. Not even the faint rustle of small animals moving through brush. It was the kind of silence that made your ears feel like they were trying too hard to listen. I kept going anyway, telling myself it was only in my head. The trail narrowed the deeper I went, and the trees felt closer, as if the forest was closing around me. My steps sounded too loud. Every time I shifted my weight, I felt like something was watching me, like something paused to listen when I moved. I tried to shake the feeling by moving faster, but the faster I walked, the more that pressure in my stomach grew. About 2 hours in, the trail sloped downward into a shallow valley filled with thick brush and large stones. I stepped down carefully, using my hands to hold tree roots so I wouldn't slip. When I reached the bottom, I noticed something unusual on the ground. Boot prints. Fresh ones. At first, it didn't bother me. People hiked all the time. But then I noticed something else. The prints were only going one way, deeper into the forest. None were coming back out. The sight of those prints slowed me down. I stared at them for a while, trying to guess how recent they were. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or leaves. Someone had walked through maybe an hour or two before me, maybe even less. But the trail was supposed to be empty today. It wasn't a popular route, and the parking area near the entrance had only one car mine. I kept moving, following the trail, but now I looked around more often. My hands felt sweaty on the straps of my backpack. The silence grew heavier the farther I went. It felt like the forest was pressing against my ears. Every step I took sounded like it echoed. Then the smell hit me. Faint, rotten smell. Not strong, but noticeable enough that I stopped. I thought maybe it was a dead animal somewhere in the bushes. I tried to ignore it, but as I walked, it got stronger, like whatever was causing it was ahead of me. The boot prints continued forward, and now I found myself stepping over them carefully, trying not to disturb them. I didn't know why. Something about them made me want to leave them untouched. After another 20 minutes, I reached a small open space where the trees thinned out. The sunlight was strong there, and for a second, I felt a sense of relief being out of that tight space of branches. But then my stomach dropped. In the dirt, near a fallen tree, I saw something that made the air feel colder. A torn piece of dark fabric. It wasn't big, maybe the size of my hand, but it was stuck to a branch in a way that made it clear it didn't just fall there by accident. It looked like someone had brushed past roughly and ripped part of their clothing. Next to it, the boot prints stopped, replaced by deep marks in the soil where someone had dragged their feet or been pulled. The earth looked churned, scattered in uneven lines. I felt my heartbeat climb up my throat. There was no sign of blood, no clear sign of what happened, but the way the soil was disturbed told me someone had struggled there. The smell was stronger too, drifting from somewhere behind a group of large rocks a little farther off the trail. I stood in the middle of that clearing for a long moment, trying to get myself to move. Part of me wanted to check behind the rocks to see if someone needed help, but another part of me, the louder, more desperate part, begged me to leave. Something about the scene didn't feel like a simple accident. It felt wrong, like I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. I heard a branch snap somewhere deeper in the woods. Not far. A clean, sharp crack that echoed through the quiet air. My whole body tensed. I didn't see anyone, but the sound wasn't made by an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, trying not to look like I was in a rush even though every nerve in my body screamed to run. After a minute, I heard another sound. Leaves moving. Slow, steady steps. Not mine. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see whoever or whatever was there. I kept my pace steady, breathing through my nose, trying to act calm even though my legs felt ready to give out. When the steps got closer, not fast but steady, I finally gave up on pretending. I started walking faster, then faster, then I was jogging. And when I heard the steps speed up too, I broke into a full run. I ran uphill, through narrow sections of the trail, brushing branches with my arms, almost slipping on loose rocks. My lungs burned, and my breath felt heavy, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The forest blurred around me as I pushed myself harder than I ever had. All I could think about was reaching the trail entrance, getting back to my car, locking the doors. After what felt like forever, I saw the sunlight opening through the trees ahead, the parking area. I ran until my legs almost folded beneath me. When I reached my car, I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I stared at the narrow entrance to the trail, waiting to see someone appear, but no one did. Nothing moved. The forest looked calm, as if nothing had happened at all. I drove away so fast my hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached a main road with cars and noise and people. Only then did I feel safe enough to breathe properly. I reported what I saw the next day. The tracks, the torn fabric, the smell, the area where the soil looked disturbed. I didn't go with them when they searched. Couldn't. But later, they told me they found signs of a struggle, and they were investigating it as a missing person case. They didn't share details, and I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't supposed to be on that trail that day. I wasn't supposed to see those tracks or that torn fabric or hear those steps behind me. I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't turned around when I did, or if I had gone to check behind those rocks. I think about how quiet the forest became before anything happened, as if the whole place was warning me in its own way. I haven't gone hiking alone since then, and I never will again. I had taken many hikes in my life, but the one that still sits heavy in my chest happened on a cold late autumn afternoon in a place I barely even chose. It was random, almost careless. I had been driving for hours through a dull stretch of countryside, my head full of noise from work and stress, and when I saw a small wooden sign pointing to a trail, I pulled over without thinking. I just wanted to walk somewhere quiet and breathe real air. That simple impulse is what pushed me into the most frightening few hours I've ever lived through. The trail started from a small dirt parking patch with only one other car sitting there, coated in dust like it had been abandoned long before I arrived. There were no people around, no sound except the wind running through bare branches and the faint ticking from my cooling engine. The air had that dry, cold smell that tells you daylight won't last much longer. I zipped my jacket up and stepped onto the path, telling myself I'd stay close and not go too deep. But the trail looked peaceful, almost too inviting, with tall pines forming a dark green tunnel over the narrow dirt path. At first the walk felt calming. The ground was soft under my boots, covered in old needles and a thin layer of frost. My breath came out in white clouds that hung in front of me before fading away. I liked the feeling of being away from everything, hearing only my footsteps and the rustling of branches above me. But after 20 or 30 minutes, I started to feel a strange awareness, like the woods were slowly closing in. The trail became tighter, the trees growing closer together, their trunks darker, shadows thicker. I kept going, telling myself it was just the lack of sunlight. After a while, I noticed something odd. The sound of the forest seemed different. There were no birds, no small animals hustling through the brush, no distant insects. Just the steady scrape of my boots and the wind pushing through the canopy. The deeper I went, the stronger the silence felt. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin tighten. I decided I would turn around soon, but when I checked the time on my phone, I realized how fast the day was slipping away. The sky between the branches had shifted into a pale gray. I stopped walking for a moment to listen. That was when I heard it. Something faint, something that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. It was a soft crunch, like weight shifting on dry leaves. Came from somewhere behind me. I stood still, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a branch falling. But the steps didn't sound random. They sounded timed, slow, heavy enough that they didn't match any small animal. When I turned around, I saw nothing but the trail stretching back through the trees, empty and still. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I forced myself to breathe normally and started walking again, but now every few steps I would hear that sound behind me. Soft crunches, then quiet, then another one. I didn't want to run because running feels like an announcement of fear, but my pace picked up without me deciding. The trail curved slightly to the right, and when I reached that bend, I glanced back again. Again, nothing, and yet the feeling of being followed pressed harder, like a hand on the back of my neck. The worst part was when I realized the ground ahead looked unfamiliar. I had been following a narrow marked path earlier. Now the markers were gone. I checked the trees around me and saw nothing but rough bark and moss. I slowed down and tried to remember if the trail had split somewhere, but I couldn't. It felt impossible, like I had walked into a different forest without noticing. For a few minutes I kept moving forward, hoping the trail would appear again. Then I heard a new sound, a dry snapping sound, sharper than the quiet footsteps before, came from my left, deeper in the trees. I froze instantly. The snapping sound repeated again, closer this time, followed by the rustle of something large brushing against branches. I stepped back, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but the way the brush moved, I knew something big was there. I didn't know if it was an animal or a person, but either one was bad news. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone when I pulled it out. Of course, there was no signal, only one tiny bar that flickered and vanished again. The battery was low too, only 18%. I turned around and started moving the way I thought the trail had been, but the forest felt twisted, like everything looked the same no matter which direction I faced. Every tree looked like the last. My shoulders were tense, my breathing tight, and every few seconds I heard movement somewhere behind me. Slow, steady, deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal wandering. It sounded like something pacing itself with my steps. I kept walking for what felt like half an hour, though it was probably much less. The sky had gone a darker shade of gray, and the cold started cutting through my jacket. My hands felt numb. The fear kept growing, piling up inside my stomach until every sound felt like a warning. I finally saw something that gave me hope. An old wooden post sticking out of the ground. It looked like it used to hold a trail marker, but the paint had faded off. Still, it meant I was close to the real path again. I moved faster toward it, checking behind me every few seconds. The forest was darker now, but I saw something move. Not clearly, just a shift in the shadows. Something tall, human-sized, standing just behind a cluster of trees far down the path. When I blinked, the shape wasn't there anymore. My legs felt weak, but I pushed myself forward until the real trail returned under my boots. I recognized the ground. I recognized the split in the trees overhead. I felt a rush of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I kept following the path, moving as fast as I could without running. The woods behind me stayed silent for a few minutes, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then I heard it again, the slow, heavy crunch of footsteps on leaves. Closer now, closer than before. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. I knew something was following me, and I knew it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I kept my eyes fixed forward and followed the trail until the trees began to open up. I saw the faint outline of the parking patch through the branches. When I stepped out of the tree line, the cold air hit me harder, but it felt cleaner, safer. I could see my car sitting alone. The other dusty car was still there, unmoved, windows fogged over from the cold. I didn't dare look behind me again. I unlocked my car, climbed inside, and shut the door with shaking hands. I hit the lock button twice just to be sure. I sat there for a few seconds trying to slow my breathing. The forest edge looked calm from the inside of the car, almost harmless. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had followed me. When I started the engine and pulled away, I kept my eyes on the mirror even though the fading light made it hard to see anything clearly. As I drove down the empty road, I finally let myself breathe normally again. But I didn't stop watching the tree line until it disappeared behind me. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe that's the part that keeps replaying in my mind. It wasn't a ghost or anything impossible. It was something real, something with weight, something that walked like a person. And what scares me most is knowing that if I had taken a wrong step, if I had walked a little slower, if the daylight had faded just a bit sooner, I don't think I would have made it back to the trail at all. I didn't really plan anything that day. I just wanted to clear my head. I picked a random trail on the map, one I had never seen before, and drove out there without thinking much about it. It was one of those quiet winter afternoons when the air feels sharp and empty and the sky looks like old metal. The trail wasn't popular. There were no other cars. The parking lot was nothing more than a patch of dirt with a broken wooden sign leaning sideways. I remember feeling a strange sense of peace at first. It was the kind of quiet that wraps around you and makes you think the world has stopped moving for a moment. I started walking without any real goal. I just wanted to see how far the trail went. The first part of the hike felt normal. The trees were tall and thin, with gray bark and bare branches stretching out overhead. The ground was covered with frozen leaves that cracked under my boots, and every time I stepped, the sound echoed through the trees like I was walking through an empty hall. For a while, that echo felt calming. It made the forest feel open, not threatening. I didn't expect anything strange. I didn't expect anything at all. About 30 minutes in, the trees changed without me noticing right away. They grew closer together, tighter, leaving less room for the wind to move through them. The air felt heavier, like the space between the trunks was holding its breath. I kept going because I wanted to make the hike worth something. The trail was still clear, so I didn't think much about it, but I could feel something shifting around me. The peaceful quiet from earlier had changed into something else. It felt like the kind of silence that appears right before something goes wrong. I walked farther, and the trail took me down a shallow slope. As I reached the bottom, I saw something strange in the distance, something out of place. At first it looked like pieces of wood scattered around the forest floor, but when I got closer, I realized they were not just fallen branches. They were old boards, planks, and broken beams. Some were sticking up from the ground at weird angles, others leaning against trees. There were even rusted metal pieces mixed in. It looked like some kind of structure had collapsed long ago, but there were no signs of a foundation or walls. Everything was spread out too far, like whatever used to be there had been torn apart and thrown around. The deeper I walked into that area, the more wrong it felt. The boards had strange marks on them, deep cuts like someone had hacked at them with something sharp. The metal pieces were bent, not just rusted. It didn't look like the usual ruins left behind by time and weather. It looked like force, violent force. But I kept going because curiosity pushed me forward, and I kept telling myself there had to be some normal explanation. Then I noticed something I didn't see before. The boards weren't only scattered around. They were arranged in certain ways, almost like pathways or shapes. Narrow lines, curved lines. Some pieces were stacked, but not like a building. More like someone had been trying to form patterns. Human-made patterns. It didn't look artistic or thoughtful. It looked frantic, like someone had been doing it fast, or in a state of panic. I felt cold in a different way than, not from the weather, from inside. My stomach tightened. My legs felt heavier. I should have turned back at that point, but I didn't. Something in me kept pushing forward, maybe because I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe because part of me wanted proof of what this place really was. I moved deeper into the scattered ruins. The ground was uneven, with chunks of wood and metal sticking out everywhere. I had to step carefully. Then I saw something that made every hair on my body rise. In the middle of a small clearing were 3 wooden poles, all different heights, stuck into the ground in a perfect straight line. They were too intentional to be accidents, and too old to be part of any recent construction. The tops were smooth, not broken, like they had been sawed clean. The wood was dark and wet-looking even though it hadn't rained. I stood still for a long time. I didn't hear animals. I didn't hear wind. I didn't hear anything except my breathing. I felt like I had stepped into a place where I wasn't supposed to be, like I had walked straight into someone's forgotten history, a dark one. My eyes kept moving from tree to tree, expecting to see someone watching, even though I knew nobody was there. When I finally forced myself to leave the clearing, I moved fast, but not too fast. I didn't want to slip or trip on anything. I didn't want to make noise. The forest felt different on the way back. The trees felt closer. Every shadow looked like a shape crouching low. I kept hearing faint cracks in the distance, branches breaking somewhere deeper in the woods. I tried to ignore the sounds, but they kept happening, always behind me, never ahead. I told myself it was just animals, even though I hadn't seen a single one all day, not even a bird. I walked faster. My backpack bounced against my shoulders, and I had to steady it with one hand to keep it from making noise. I kept imagining the poles in that clearing, the strange patterns on the ground, the hacked wood, and the bent metal. None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more my chest tightened. I didn't feel like I had found ruins. I felt like I had found evidence of something someone wanted to forget or hide. The sounds behind me got louder, more frequent. My brain kept trying to explain them. Maybe branches breaking under snow. Maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But the sounds didn't move the way animals move. They stopped when I stopped. They continued when I continued. The pattern matched me too closely. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as my legs could move without losing balance. The trail felt longer on the way out. Every turn looked like the last one. I kept feeling like I was going in circles, but I wasn't. I recognized the slope, the tree with the split trunk, the patch of moss shaped like a long oval. I was on the right path, but even knowing that didn't calm me. The sound behind me didn't go away. When I finally saw the thin light of the parking area through the trees, something inside me loosened, but only for a moment. The forest still felt like it was pressing against my back, like the silence itself was pushing me out. I walked straight to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and got inside without looking back. I didn't breathe properly until I drove away and the trees thinned out in my rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone about what I found. I didn't report it. I didn't try to research it. I decided it wasn't my place to dig deeper into something I barely understood. But I kept thinking about those poles, those hacked boards, and those bent pieces of metal. I kept thinking about the way the sounds followed me all the way back. I started to understand something simple but important. Just because something is real doesn't mean it wants to be found. I haven't gone hiking on a random trail since that day. I only go to places I know now, places where people walk, places with noise and life and normal things. Because sometimes the scariest places aren't the ones with legends or stories. Sometimes the scariest places are the ones nobody talks about at all. And whatever happened in that part of the woods, whatever made those patterns and tore that place apart, I don't need answers. The only thing that matters is that I left, and I didn't go back. That was enough. That was my ending. I made it out, and I learned to respect the places that feel wrong from the moment you step into them, even when you can't explain why. I did not plan anything special that morning. I just wanted a long, quiet hike to clear my head. I picked a random trail on the map, one I had never tried before, a thin line cutting through a stretch of forest that looked empty and forgotten. It seemed good enough for a few hours outside. I packed only what I needed: water, a small snack, a jacket, and my phone with a half-charged battery. The weather looked fine, and I felt sure it would be an easy day. The first part of the trail felt peaceful. The air was cool. The light slipped through the trees in soft strips, and the ground felt dry under my boots. I walked without hurry, listening to the small sounds around me. Wind pushing through branches, insects buzzing somewhere unseen, the soft crunch of old leaves under each step. Everything felt normal and harmless, the kind of quiet that makes you breathe a little deeper. I liked that feeling, and for the first hour, nothing strange happened at all. The trail slowly grew narrower as I kept moving. I noticed how the trees became taller and closer together, making the sunlight fade more and more until everything turned dim even though it was still morning. The ground shifted from dry dirt to thick patches of mud that sucked at my boots. I told myself the narrow trail was expected in older forest sections, but something in my chest felt tight, like I was walking deeper into a place that did not get many visitors. After another half hour, the silence changed. I started hearing noises behind me from time to time. Quick, soft sounds, almost like someone stepping on twigs, but stopping the moment I tried to pay attention. I thought it was probably an animal, maybe a stray dog or a deer. Things like that usually run away from people anyway. But the noises did not fade. They came and went, always behind me, always just slow enough to feel like something was following but not close enough to see. I kept walking, pretending everything was normal, but my back felt warm with anxiety. Every few minutes I looked over my shoulder, and every time I found only the empty path behind me. No movement, no shape, nothing. Still, each time I turned forward again, the silence seemed heavier. The trail kept getting worse. Thick branches lay across the ground. Roots twisted up like ropes, and old fallen logs forced me to climb or crawl around them. It looked like no one had cleared this path in years. My clothes grew dirty. My hands scraped from grabbing rough bark, and small bits of mud stuck to my jacket. Even then, I did not want to turn around. I kept thinking that maybe the trail would open up soon. Maybe I just needed to get past this part. But the strange noise behind me kept returning. The soft crunch of leaves, slow steps, always spaced out, almost careful. It made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I picked up my pace, moving faster than before, trying not to glance back anymore. I didn't want to look because I started to worry that one of these times I might actually see something. My breathing grew uneven, louder than I wanted. Everything about the forest felt wrong now. The shadows looked too thick, the air too still. Then the trail suddenly stopped. I didn't expect it at all. I pushed through a patch of tall bushes, trying to stay on the faint line of old footprints and worn dirt, but the path simply ended. No signpost, no fork, not even a faded marker on a tree. Just forest in every direction, thick and messy, without any trace of human steps. I stared at the empty space ahead for a long moment, trying to force my mind to accept that I had somehow walked off the trail without noticing. But the ground behind me showed the line clearly. I had been following the right way. It had just ended. Standing there, I felt an immediate pressure move through my body, something like fear rising fast from my stomach to my throat. I knew I had to turn around and retrace every step until I reached the wider part of the trail again. I took one slow breath and turned back. That was when I saw the footprint. It was in the mud, right in the middle of where I had walked moments earlier. It wasn't mine. It was larger, deeper, and facing toward me. My chest tightened until I almost couldn't breathe. Someone had stepped there after I passed. Someone had been following behind me closely enough to leave fresh marks. My skin felt cold. I looked up the path, the narrow muddy stretch between the trees, and I tried to spot movement. But the path was empty again. Only trees, shadows, and that heavy silence that felt thick enough to choke on. I started walking back, much faster this time, my heart thumping hard against my ribs. I kept my eyes forward, but I felt watched the whole time. The forest seemed different now. Darker, closer, like the branches leaned inward. Even the air smelled strange, like damp metal and old wood. I stepped over logs and pushed through leaves that brushed against my face. My hands shook each time I moved a branch away from my body. Every few seconds I heard another soft sound behind me, but I did not dare to turn around again. I just kept moving. When I finally recognized a broken tree I had passed earlier, I felt a burst of hope. I knew I was moving the right way. I walked faster, almost jogging now, even though the ground was uneven. My boots slipped against wet patches and roots, and I almost fell twice, but I didn't stop. My mind kept repeating one thought over and over again. Get out. Somewhere behind me, something made a long, dragging sound through the leaves. Not a step this time. Something heavier. My whole body reacted before my mind did. I broke into a full run. Branches cut my arms. Roots almost twisted my ankles, and mud splashed up onto my legs. But I kept going. My breath tore out of my chest in loud gasps. The forest felt endless, like I'd never reach the wider trail again. Then I saw it, the section of the path where the trees were spaced wider, the place where the sunlight actually reached the ground. I pushed myself harder, knowing I was close, knowing I just had to reach that area. When I stepped into that brighter patch of forest, the air felt different, lighter, and for the first time in over an hour, I didn't hear anything behind me. No steps, no dragging sounds, nothing. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead near the parking area. Only then did I turn around. The forest looked normal again. Quiet, empty, harmless. But the feeling of being watched stayed heavy on my skin. My clothes were dirty, my legs sore, and my hands scraped. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the trail I had walked hours earlier, trying to make sense of what had happened. Nothing moved in the trees. No figure stepped out. No sound came from deeper inside. Just silence. I walked back to my car and sat there for a long time, letting the fear drain slowly out of me while my heartbeat returned to normal. I kept picturing that footprint in the mud, the deeper one that wasn't mine, facing straight toward me. Someone had been there. Someone had followed me silently for almost the entire hike. I never went back to that trail. I never even figured out what direction I actually hiked into. But I know what I felt and I know what I saw. And the reality of it is simple and painfully clear. There are places in the woods where people rarely go, places that look quiet and harmless on a map but feel very different when you stand inside them. And sometimes, without knowing it, you walk into parts of the forest where someone else is already there. Someone who doesn't want to be seen. Someone who steps exactly when you step. Someone who follows you deeper and deeper until the trail ends and you finally realize you are not alone. I was lucky that day. I made it back while it was still light. I found the open trail before my legs gave out. But I still think about the moment when the sound stopped behind me, the moment I stepped into the wider, brighter part of the forest. It never felt like whoever was there gave up. It felt like they just stopped because I had left the part of the woods that belonged to them. And that thought alone is enough to keep me away from random trails forever. I started the hike just after sunrise, when the air was still cold enough to pinch the inside of my nose. I had picked a random trail off an old map I kept in my car, a narrow route that cut through miles of quiet forest and followed a long ridge I had never explored before. I liked doing that sometimes, choosing a place without thinking too much and just going. It felt pure, simple, and real. But that morning, The forest felt heavier than usual, like the trees were holding something back. I didn't think much of it at first. I just wanted to walk, breathe, and clear my head. The trail started as a dirt path with patches of frost still clinging to the edges. My boots made soft cracks in the cold ground with every step. The forest was empty, not a single person anywhere, and even the birds seemed slow to start their morning. As I walked deeper, the trees grew taller and the path narrowed until I had to step over fallen logs and duck under slanted branches. The silence felt strange. I'm used to quiet when hiking, but this was different. It was the kind of silence that made the sound of my breath feel too loud. After about an hour, I reached a steep slope where the trail curved around a rocky wall. I remember touching the stone with my hand because it was colder than the air, almost icy. The trail flattened after that, running along the ridge. From up there, I could see the valley stretching far below, covered in a thick mix of pine and dead brush. It looked peaceful from above, but something about the shape of the shadows moving between the trees made me uneasy. I kept going anyway, telling myself it was just my mind wandering. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed fresh footprints on the ground. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were larger, deeper, and heading in the same direction I was going. The soil was soft in that area, which meant whoever made them had passed through recently, very recently. They weren't running prints, though. They were slow, steady steps, almost too steady, like the person didn't care about anything around them. I didn't hear anyone ahead, but the forest swallowed sound in a strange way on that ridge. The next hour felt tense. I kept my pace slow, listening to every rustle, every shift of the wind. A few times I stopped completely because I thought I heard something behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting, something moving at the same speed I was. But each time I turned around, the trail was empty. My mind kept telling me I was imagining it, but the sound was real enough to make the hair on my arms rise. I kept walking until I reached the old fire road shown on the map. It was barely a road anymore, just two faint lines of flattened dirt with tall grass growing in the middle. The footprints continued down that road, deeper into the woods. I didn't want to follow them, but the trail itself crossed the road and kept going. I stepped onto it, but the air felt heavier again, almost thicker. I could taste dirt in the air, as if something had been moving through the area recently and kicked everything up. As I walked, the smell changed. It wasn't the normal forest smell anymore. It was a sharp, sour scent mixed with something metallic. I couldn't place it at first. It wasn't blood, not exactly, but something close. The smell got stronger the farther I went. I felt my stomach tighten, and every part of me started telling me to turn back. But the path was narrow and twisted, and I kept thinking I just needed to reach the next clearing to understand what it was. I reached the clearing after another 15 minutes. It wasn't large, just a small break between the trees where the sunlight could touch the ground. That's when I saw it. A torn backpack lying in the dirt, ripped down the side like someone had dragged it across the ground. The zipper was snapped off and the straps were frayed. Next to it was a boot, a single hiking boot with mud on the heel and a broken shoelace. The metal smell in the air was strongest there. I crouched down and touched the backpack. The fabric was damp, but the ground around it was dry. I didn't see blood, didn't see any sign of an animal, but the scene didn't look right at all. Before I could stand up, I heard a sound behind me. Not a twig snapping this time, not a rustle. It was the sound of slow, heavy breathing. Human breathing. I felt it more than I heard it, like the air thickened behind my back. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see who or what was standing there. My hands were shaking so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingers. I forced myself to stand slowly, pretending I didn't notice anything. I stepped away from the backpack, still not turning around. Then I took another step. The breathing stayed the same, close, calm, steady. Too steady. I don't remember when I finally turned, but when I did, there was no one there. The trees stood still. The air was still. The trail behind me was empty. I felt sick. I wasn't imagining the breathing. It was too close, too real. I backed away from the clearing until I reached the trail again. Then I started walking back the way I came, faster and faster, trying not to break into a full run. The forest felt wrong around me, as if something was moving just out of sight. I kept hearing faint steps behind me, matching mine, stopping whenever I stopped. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun had shifted and the shadows were longer. The valley below looked darker now. Halfway across the ridge, I saw fresh footprints again, this time behind mine. I hadn't seen them earlier. Someone had followed me, stepping in the same direction I had come from. The prints were deep, and the spacing between them was wider than a normal walking pace, almost like the person was closing the distance between us. I didn't stop again after that. I moved as fast as I could without slipping, my legs burning, my lungs aching. Every few seconds, I felt like someone was behind me. The forest stayed silent, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something was watching. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look back at the trail. I threw my gear inside and locked the doors immediately. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire drive home. Even when I was miles away, the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were real. I know they followed me, and the worst part is that I never heard them leave. I don't know when they stopped walking behind me. I don't know if they actually did, but I do know one thing. Whoever left those footprints, whoever stood behind me in that clearing, they knew that trail better than I did. They were quiet in a way no normal person should be, patient in a way that didn't feel natural. And when I think about the torn backpack and the single boot left behind, I know I didn't imagine the danger. Someone else had walked that trail before me, and someone didn't walk out. I did, but I think it was only because I turned back when I did. And I'm never choosing a random trail again. I started the hike a little after sunrise, when the air still felt cold and sharp. I picked a random trail from the map, one I had never tried before, because I wanted something new, something that would push me a little farther than usual. The forest around this place always looked calm from the highway, but once I stepped off the gravel parking area and walked past the small wooden sign, I felt that deep and quiet heaviness that only comes from places where people rarely go. The trees were tall and straight, like old pillars holding up the sky, and the ground smelled of cold dirt and wet leaves. I carried only what I needed: water, snacks, a small first aid kit, my phone, and a flashlight. The trail itself was narrow and uneven, with roots twisting out of the ground like thin, dark fingers. I could hear the soft crunch under my boots as I moved farther in, and I kept noticing how still everything felt. No wind, no birds, not even the usual insects buzzing around. It made me feel like I had stepped into something sealed off from the rest of the world. The deeper I went, the more the trail changed. The trees grew closer together, the ground dipped in strange slopes, and the air felt heavier. But I kept going, following the thin strip of dirt that seemed to guide me deeper and deeper into the woods. I wasn't scared at first. I liked being away from noise, away from people, away from anything that could distract me. The quiet felt good. But then, maybe an hour in, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been pretty clear up to that point, began to split into thin side paths. The splits weren't on my map. They looked old and barely used. I ignored them and stayed on the main line, but after a while I realized the trail wasn't matching the map anymore. The turns were wrong, the slopes were too steep, and the ground felt untouched, like no one had walked here in years. I stopped, drank some water, and checked my phone. No signal. The map app was useless without it. I wasn't worried yet, but I did feel a small drop in my stomach, like the first sign of something slipping out of my control. I kept hiking because turning back felt too early. I convinced myself I would recognize something on the way back. The trees all looked the same, but I tried to pay attention to little things. Bent branches, odd-shaped rocks, patches of moss. Anything that could help. About 30 minutes later, I reached an area where the trees thinned out. The ground opened into a long, narrow clearing. The grass there was short and dry, and the shape of the space felt strange, like something had pressed through it, flattening everything, but not recently. More like a long time ago. The way the ground dipped in the center made me uneasy. It didn't look natural. I walked around the edge of the clearing and saw something that made my skin tighten. On one of the trees, carved into the bark, was a deep line, straight and long, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. The cut wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I found another one on a tree nearby, same height, same direction. When I looked farther into the trees, I noticed even more of them, almost forming a line, as if someone or something had dragged a blade or tool while walking in a straight path. I felt a cold feeling move down my back. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anyone, but the idea of being this far in the forest with signs of someone carving their way through made everything inside me tighten. I turned around and decided it was time to head back, but the trail behind me didn't look like the one I had walked in on. I walked anyway, choosing the path that felt most correct, but the trees looked unfamiliar, the ground felt steeper, and every few minutes I would pass another carved tree. The marks were getting more recent. The wood around the cuts looked lighter, cleaner. Whoever made them had done it very recently, maybe that morning. My breathing grew louder in my ears. I kept walking faster. The forest that felt calm earlier now felt like it was pressing in on me. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt like something was listening. At one point I noticed footprints. Not mine. These were deeper, wider, and far more spaced apart, like someone much heavier had moved through the same direction. They led down a slope. I didn't want to follow them, but they were right in the middle of what looked like the only clear way out. I tried to avoid looking at them, but every time I stepped around one, I felt more aware of how alone I was. The slope led into another clearing, this one even stranger. Broken branches everywhere. A torn backpack half buried under leaves. No name tag. The straps were ripped, not cut. The fabric looked stretched, pulled apart. I felt my chest tighten. I backed away slowly, not wanting to touch anything. My mind kept telling me to stay calm, but my body was already reacting. Heart pounding, legs shaking, hands sweating so much I could barely grip my bottle. I turned and moved quickly, choosing the steep incline back uphill. I didn't care if it was the wrong way. I just needed distance. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, but I didn't stop. Every few minutes I checked behind me, even though I heard nothing. The stillness felt alive, like something heavy was moving through it without sound. After what felt like an hour of climbing, I finally saw something familiar. A twisted stump I remembered from earlier in the day. I almost fell from relief. I kept moving, faster now, almost jogging. The forest slowly began to open up again. The trail became clearer, the ground more worn. I recognized more details. Bent roots, a rock shaped like a wedge, a fallen log with pale mushrooms. Finally, through the trees, I saw the faint shape of the wooden sign near the trailhead. And behind that, through the gaps in the branches, I saw the top of my car. My legs felt weak, like they might give out, but I pushed forward until I stepped out of the tree line and onto the gravel. I didn't stop walking until I reached the driver's seat. I shut the door, locked it, and sat there breathing hard, sweat cooling on my back. Only then did I look into the woods one more time. Far in the distance, through the narrow line of trees, I saw one carved trunk. The mark was fresh, much fresher than the ones deeper in the forest. It hadn't been there that morning. Something had passed near the trailhead while I was inside. I drove away without stopping. The ending was clear to me the whole drive home. I wasn't lost in those woods. I was being followed through them. And whatever made those carvings, whatever left those footprints and tore that backpack apart, wasn't far behind me. If I had taken one wrong turn, if I had hesitated for even a moment, I don't think I would have made it back to the trailhead at all. I started the hike late in the afternoon, which was already a stupid choice, but I pushed myself anyway because the whole week had been a mess and I wanted a quiet trail to clear my head. I picked a random forested ridge trail I found on an old hiking forum, something people described as lonely but beautiful. The word lonely was exactly what I thought I needed at the time. I didn't even check recent comments or updates. I just packed some snacks, water, and a small first aid kit, and drove out there like I had something to prove to myself. The moment I stepped onto the trail, I knew it felt different. The air was still, thicker than the usual mountain air I was used to. The trees leaned in close, as if the whole place had grown tired over the years and started folding in on itself. The path was narrow and scattered with fallen branches that looked like they had been lying there for months. There were no real signs of fresh foot traffic, no recent boot prints, no bike tracks, nothing. Still, I kept going, telling myself that maybe this was what quiet really felt like. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper and looser under my boots. Small rocks shifted and rolled whenever I stepped on them. The higher sections wrapped along the edge of the ridge, giving short views of distant hills and a long stretch of dark pines that reached out for miles. At first, I felt something like peace. My breath fell into a steady rhythm, and for a little while the only sound I heard was the steady crunch of dirt under me. But as the sun dipped lower, I noticed something odd. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt like the air behind me tightened. I didn't hear anything clear or sharp, just the faintest shift, like someone placing a foot softly on loose dirt from far away. It was never loud, never sudden, always subtle. So subtle that I kept brushing it off as the forest settling, or squirrels moving through leaves, or just my own heartbeat pushing too loud in my ears. Still, it kept happening. Every time I stopped, something felt like it stopped behind me too. When I started moving again, the space around me seemed to widen just enough to feel normal again. The trail reached a long, slanted section where the ground dipped toward a thick patch of undergrowth. The trees there were crowded together tightly, and the brush underneath them looked untouched. The kind of untouched that made me wonder if even animals avoided it. The sun was fading faster than I expected, and a cold wind started to crawl up the slope. I walked a little faster, checking my watch and realizing I had maybe 40 minutes before the light died completely. I should have turned back right then. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was because I didn't want to admit I made a dumb decision starting late. Maybe it was the strange quiet pressing at my back, making me want to reach the viewpoint the trail promised. Another 10 minutes passed before I saw it. A torn piece of dark fabric caught on a branch lying across the trail. It wasn't old. The edges were sharp, not frayed. I bent down and picked it up. Felt like jacket material, possibly a sleeve. I didn't see any tracks or disturbed dirt around it. Just that piece of fabric sitting there as if someone had brushed past only hours before. My chest grew tight. The forest suddenly felt too silent, like everything was waiting for me to keep moving. And in the corner of my vision, in the thick patch of trees beside the trail, something shifted. Not fast, not sharp, but enough to make the outline of a trunk blur for a second. I froze. I listened. The air around me held its breath. Then the wind moved through the canopy, and the moment passed. I told myself it was just branches swaying, nothing more, but now I felt watched, fully watched. Not the vague feeling I brushed off earlier. This one was direct, heavy, as if someone stood behind the undergrowth with their eyes fixed on me, waiting for my next step. I tightened my backpack straps and sped up the trail. My mouth was dry, and every 30 seconds I glanced behind me. The trail behind me looked empty, but the shadows between the trees felt thicker now. They looked like places someone could stand motionless and not be seen. The trail finally reached a narrow wooden footbridge that crossed over a deep, dry wash. The wash was filled with broken branches and large boulders. I walked across the bridge quickly, but halfway over it, I felt the boards vibrate in a way that didn't match my footsteps. The vibration was faint, but it was there, just a slight flex in the wood behind me, like weight was shifting on it. I kept going. I didn't dare turn around. When I reached the other side, I stepped off the bridge and forced myself forward. My legs felt hollow. My breathing was too loud. The trail curved sharply ahead, and I used that moment to look back. The bridge was empty, but the undergrowth on the far side wasn't still anymore. Something deep in those shadows pulled back, like someone slowly stepping out of sight. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped my water bottle. There was no reason for anyone to hide from me unless they didn't want to be seen. and there was no reason to follow quietly unless they didn't want me to know they were there. I didn't run, but I walked faster than I ever had in my life. The viewpoint wasn't worth dying for. I decided right there I was turning around and heading back to the car as fast as possible. I kept checking behind me, and the forest behind me seemed to shift subtly every time I looked, like something slipped behind a tree just before my eyes landed on it. The worst moment came near the trailhead, where the trees opened up and the light finally returned. I turned one last time, just before stepping into the clearing where my car waited. Nothing stood on the trail, but deep between the trees, far back where the light faded into gray, I saw the faint, unmoving shape of a person standing still among the trunks. No face, no details, just the shape, motionless, watching. I didn't wait to confirm it. I walked straight to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and drove away so fast I barely looked in the rearview mirror. By the time I reached the main road, the sky had gone dark, and my breath finally slowed enough to feel real again. I learned something that day, something that settled deep in my bones and never left. Forests hold things that don't have to be supernatural to be terrifying. A real person, hiding, following quietly, careful enough to never let me see their face. That was worse than anything imaginary. It made everything feel unsafe in a way I had never felt before. And the ending is simple and clear. I never went back to that trail. I never tried to find out who or what was following me. I didn't need answers. I only needed the truth I already saw with my own eyes. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods is a real human being who knows how to stay hidden, who watches without being caught, and who chooses you as the reason they step quietly between the trees. I started that hike without thinking much about it. I just wanted a quiet day alone in the woods, far from noise and people. I chose a random trail on the map, a long loop that moved through a thick forest, crossed a few small hills, and circled back to the parking area. I had never been there before, and that was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted something different, something that felt empty and untouched. The sky was pale when I started, with a soft layer of gray clouds that made the whole forest look dull but calm. The air felt cool, and I liked the way it filled my lungs. The first part of the hike felt normal. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. Fallen leaves covered most of the dirt, and they made that soft crunch under my boots that always feels nice when you walk alone. The trees were close together, their branches almost touching above my head. I kept moving at a steady pace, taking slow breaths, enjoying the quiet. Every now and then, I would hear a small animal in the bushes or the distant tapping of a woodpecker. Everything felt peaceful and harmless, exactly what I wanted. About an hour in, the trail started to rise, climbing a hill that was steeper than it looked on the map. My legs began to burn a little, and I took small breaks to catch my breath. I noticed that the forest felt thicker up there. The trees grew taller, and the branches blocked a lot of the light. It felt darker even though it was still morning. The air felt heavier too, like there was less space to breathe. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the change in elevation and the way the woods were shaped. When I reached the top of the hill, I stopped for a moment and looked around. The trail split into two paths, even though the map showed only one. One path looked more used, with clear footprints and flattened leaves. The other path looked old, narrower, with branches leaning over it like they hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I should have taken the clearer path without thinking, but for some reason, the old path pulled my attention. Maybe I wanted a bit more adventure. Maybe I wanted to feel like I was somewhere people rarely went. Without thinking too hard, I walked down the older trail. The change was instant. The forest became almost silent, too silent for what I was used to. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds. Just my steps and the faint rustle of my backpack. The air felt colder, and I noticed a smell I couldn't place at first. It wasn't strong, but it had a strange dirt and metal scent to it, almost like wet soil mixed with something rusty. It bothered me, but I kept going, telling myself it was just natural decay or old iron from something hidden underground. The trail sank into a deeper part of the forest, and the trees around me started to look twisted. Their trunks leaned in odd angles, and some had deep marks in them. Long vertical scratches that didn't look like anything an animal would make. They were too straight, too clean, almost like they were carved. I passed the first tree with those marks and felt a small chill crawl across my skin. When I saw the second and third tree with the same marks, the feeling in my stomach tightened. I slowed down. Something felt wrong. I knew it, but I kept walking because the trail looked like it continued forward. I thought that maybe it would loop back to the proper path eventually. But the farther I went, the more the ground changed. The dirt looked darker and softer, almost like it had been dug up and replaced. There were patches that felt uneven under my boots, like the soil had been disturbed recently. I noticed small holes in the ground too, shallow pits scattered around the trees. Some looked fresh, like someone had scooped the dirt out with a tool. I kept staring at them, trying to understand what I was looking at, but my mind kept trying to push it away. The smell grew stronger the deeper I moved, still not overpowering, but enough that I kept breathing through my mouth. It smelled like old sweat mixed with something rotten, something that had been left in a closed place for too long. My chest felt tight, and a strange pressure grew inside me, like my body was trying to warn me before my mind could catch up. After another 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like nothing unusual, just an open patch with fewer trees. But then I saw the ground. It was covered with those pits, maybe a dozen of them, some shallow and some deeper. The soil around them was turned and messy, almost like someone had been working there with urgency. In the center of the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pile of clothing, dirty, ripped, and colorless from weather, sat half-buried under leaves. Pants, a jacket, and what looked like parts of a shirt. They were all different sizes, like they didn't belong to one person. I froze, staring at the pile, feeling my heartbeat climb into my throat. My skin prickled with fear. There was no reason for a random trail to have something like that. No reason for a place in the woods to look like a dozen holes were being dug again and again. No reason for clothes to be left in a pile like that, unless something bad had happened there. That was the moment I finally turned back. I didn't run at first because I didn't want to trip or make noise. I moved as fast as I could without losing control. My hands were shaking, and my breath felt sharp in my chest. Every sound around me, even the small ones, felt too close, too quick. I kept telling myself not to look behind me, not to imagine anything following me. Just move, just get out of that part of the forest. When I reached the point where the old path met the main trail, I almost collapsed from the relief. The air felt normal again, and the silence softened. I forced myself to walk all the way back to the parking lot without stopping. My legs burned, my throat was dry, and my back felt sweaty even in the cold air. The whole time, I felt like something heavy was pressing against me from behind, like I wasn't alone anymore, even if I couldn't see anyone. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack inside and sat down without thinking. My hands were still trembling, and I had to sit for a few minutes before I could even start the engine. As I drove away, the forest looked peaceful again, calm and harmless, almost like it had swallowed everything I saw and left no trace behind. I didn't report anything that day because I didn't even know how to explain what I saw without sounding strange. Instead, I went back the next morning with the intention of taking photos and showing someone. But when I reached the same trail, something had changed. The old path wasn't there anymore. The trees looked tightened together, as if the forest had grown overnight. The ground looked untouched, with no marks, no pits, no old clothing, nothing that could prove what I saw. I stood there for a long time, staring at that spot, feeling confused and sick. I knew what I saw. I knew what I smelled. I knew the fear that crawled inside my body wasn't something I imagined. But the trail was gone. The clearing was gone. Everything had been wiped clean. That moment was when the fear turned into something worse, uncertainty. I realized I had walked into a part of the forest that someone didn't want people to find. Not something supernatural, something human, something real, something that involved digging, hiding, and returning often enough to keep the ground disturbed. Something that didn't want witnesses. I drove home with a tight chest, and every night for weeks, I would wake up thinking about the silent trees, the disturbed soil, and the pile of old clothes. I still think about it now sometimes. Not because I'm scared of the forest itself, but because I know someone uses that part of it for things they don't want the world to see. And the worst part is knowing that I only found it because I chose a random trail. I still hike, but I never go off the marked path anymore. I never follow old trails, and I never explore anything that isn't on the map. I learned that some parts of the woods aren't forgotten by nature, they're forgotten on purpose. And if I had stayed even a little longer that day, I don't think I would have made it back to the trail at all. That is the part that stays with me the most. Not the holes, not the clothes, not the smell, but the simple, heavy feeling that I left just in time. If I had reached that clearing a bit later, I might not have been the only one standing there. And whoever was digging those holes would not have wanted me to walk away. I started the hike late in the afternoon, later than I planned, but I convinced myself it was fine. The trail I chose was one I had never tried before, a long loop that cut through a thick stretch of forest. I picked it randomly earlier that morning after scrolling through a list of hiking spots online. It looked quiet, not very popular, which I thought meant peace. I wanted silence, a break from noise, from people, from everything. What I didn't expect was the type of silence I would get. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy kind that makes you notice the smallest sounds inside your own head. Right from the start, the trail felt different. The trees were tall and close together, their branches hanging low, almost touching the top of my backpack. The path itself was narrow, the kind where your shoulders sometimes brush against leaves and branches. The air was still, almost too still, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't hear any birds. Usually, forests were full of them, but here there was nothing. Only the soft sound of my boots pressing down on the old, damp leaves. As I moved deeper, the sunlight faded faster than it should have. It wasn't dark, but it felt like the trees were swallowing the light. I kept walking, telling myself I needed the exercise, that this was normal. But part of me knew something felt off. Not dangerous yet, just wrong in a way I couldn't explain. About an hour in, I noticed something strange on the ground. The leaves weren't scattered naturally. They were cleared in a straight line, like something had been dragged across them. It wasn't deep like a tire track or wide enough to be from a vehicle. It was more like something long and heavy had been pulled through the forest. I stepped over it and kept moving, but my mind kept going back to that line. I kept telling myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer dragging a broken branch or something simple like that. The deeper I went, the more the trail changed. It began to slope downward, slowly at first, then more sharply. I could feel my calves tightening from the angle. The smell of the forest changed, too. The air turned colder and smelled like wet soil, the type you find near places where sunlight never reaches. I remember wiping sweat from my face, even though the air felt cold. My body felt confused by the temperature, like it didn't know how to respond. I checked the time and realized I had been hiking longer than I planned. But for some reason, I didn't turn around. I kept thinking the loop had to curve back soon. That was the problem with random trails, you never really knew what to expect. I looked ahead and saw that the path became tighter, almost squeezed between two slanted hillsides. The trees leaned inward above me, forming a shape that felt like a tunnel. As I walked into that section, the air changed again. Thicker, harder to breathe. I slowed down without realizing it, my steps getting smaller. My backpack felt heavier, or maybe it was my chest. My ears began picking up sounds I hadn't heard before. At first, it was something small, like faint rustling far behind me. I stopped walking for a moment to listen, and when I did, everything went silent again. But the silence felt wrong. Like whatever was behind me had stopped when I stopped. I tried to ignore it because I didn't want to think about anything being back there at all. I pushed forward, and the rustling started again. Soft, slow, too slow to be wind. Every few minutes it would stop and start, almost like it was matching my pace. My heartbeat picked up faster than my footsteps. Sweat dripped down my back even though I could see my breath in the cold air. At one point, I turned around. I didn't see anything, just the narrow trail and the trees pressed close around it. The kind of forest where anything could be hiding just a few feet away and I would never know. I forced myself to turn back and keep going. My throat felt dry. I could feel my pulse in my hands. The trail eventually flattened out again, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I saw more marks on the ground, more dragged lines, but this time not just one. Several going across the trail and into the trees on both sides. They looked fresh. The leaves were pushed aside like whatever made them pass through only minutes before I got there. My legs felt weak, and for a moment I thought about running, but I knew that would only make things worse if I slipped or fell. I forced myself to walk faster, not running but close to it. My breathing turned loud in my ears, and that made it even harder to hear if the rustling was still behind me. The trail felt endless. There was no sign of the loop turning. I kept checking the tree line, the ground, anything that might give me some clue that I wasn't alone. Every few steps, I felt a sharp urge to turn around, but every time I did, there was nothing. The sun was almost gone now. The light that filtered through the trees turned orange, then darker. Shadows stretched longer and merged into each other until everything looked like one shape. I knew I had to get out before it became completely dark. Hiking at night wasn't the scary part. It was hiking in this place at night, with something following me at a distance I couldn't measure. My legs were shaking by the time I reached a fork in the trail. It wasn't on any map I remembered. There was no sign, no marking, just two paths splitting left and right. I didn't know which one would take me out. I picked the right one because it sloped upward, and I knew higher ground usually meant getting closer to the exit. I climbed fast, my breath burning. The rustling behind me grew louder, then stopped again. But this time it didn't fade into silence. It stayed there, like whatever was following me had stopped only a few feet back. I didn't turn around. I knew that if I did, my fear would freeze me in place. I pushed myself up the hill until I reached a clearing. It wasn't a big one, just enough space for a bit of sky to break through the trees. The sky was dark blue, and the first stars were coming out. I stood in the middle of the clearing, trying to catch my breath. My legs felt like they would collapse. My chest ached. But then I saw something that made everything inside me tighten. In the dirt at the edge of the clearing were footprints. Not mine. Not from hiking boots. They were bare, wide, deep in the soil, and they led straight toward the path I just climbed up. I stared at them, my pulse hammering so hard I felt dizzy. The footprints were fresh. Too fresh. That was the moment I stopped thinking about anything else. My body moved on its own. I sprinted across the clearing, back into the trees, pushing myself harder than I ever had in my life. My lungs burned. My vision shook. I didn't look back even once. I just ran, tripping, sliding, catching myself, pushing forward no matter what. It took what felt like forever, but eventually I saw a thin strip of open sky through the trees. Then I saw the dirt road that led to the parking area. My legs almost gave out when my boots hit the open ground. The forest behind me looked darker than before, like the shadows had swallowed the last bit of light. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. When I finally sat in the driver's seat, my whole body was shaking. My hands were stiff. My throat felt tight as I tried to breathe normally again. I looked at the trail entrance one last time. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, no figure. Just still trees. But I know something followed me. I never saw it, and I don't want to know what it was. Maybe it was a person, maybe something else, but nothing supernatural. Just something real that watches hikers who go too deep into quiet places. I didn't report anything because I didn't know what to report. I didn't have proof. Only the dragged lines on the ground, the footprints, and the feeling that something walked behind me for hours. But I learned something that day. The scariest things in the woods aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the real things that hide in places people don't go. The things that wait quietly until someone walks alone with no one to hear them if something happens. I haven't gone back to that trail. I don't plan to. And now, every time I choose a hiking spot, I make sure it's never random again. Never a quiet one. Never a place where silence feels heavier than the forest itself. Because I know what that silence can hide. And I don't want to hear it behind me ever again. I didn't plan anything special for that hike. I just wanted a quiet day alone in the hills, something simple to clear my head. I picked a random trail on the map, one I had never tried before, a thin line cutting through a wide stretch of forest that didn't seem very popular. The air felt cool when I stepped out of the car, and for a moment everything looked normal, harmless, and calm. I didn't know how long I would be walking, but I figured I had enough daylight and enough energy for a long, slow trek. The trail started easy. The ground felt soft under my shoes, covered with damp brown leaves that stuck to the soles. The trees were tall and thin, the kind that sway with the smallest push of wind. The smell of earth was strong, like the forest had been soaked recently. I moved deeper and deeper, watching how the light between the branches shifted from warm to dim. I liked that silence, the kind where I could hear my own breathing and the small crack of twigs under my feet. For a while, it felt peaceful, but the deeper I went, the more the space around me changed. The trees grew closer together. The trail narrowed until it looked more like an animal path than a human one. I kept going because I didn't want to turn back so early. After another hour, the ground started to slope downward. I could feel the temperature drop step by step. My arms and neck felt cold even though I was moving. I noticed small things first, tiny details that didn't feel important at the time. A torn backpack strap hanging from a branch, faded and sun-bleached. Fresh dirt piled in a way that didn't seem natural, with marks on the sides like something had been dragged. A piece of cloth stuck between rocks. Everything looked old, but not too old. Like someone had passed through recently but not long ago. By then, I hadn't seen another hiker. I realized I hadn't heard birds for a while either. The quiet became heavy, the kind that makes you too aware of your own presence. My footsteps sounded too loud, too sharp in the empty air. I slowed down without meaning to, walking softer, almost careful, like I didn't want the forest to hear me. The trail eventually leveled out into a long, narrow stretch of flat ground between two ridges. The space felt strange. The trees on both sides leaned inward as if they were closing over the path. I kept looking up, watching them bend in unnatural angles, shapes that made my stomach tighten. Then I noticed something else, footprints. Not just one set, but many, overlapping each other. At first I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape was human. Bare feet, dozens of them. Some small, some large, some deep in the mud as if the person had been running or stumbling. I froze. The prints looked recent. The moisture on their edges hadn't dried yet. I told myself someone probably walked here earlier, maybe a group that liked barefoot hiking or something unusual but harmless. But the sheer number of them made the explanation feel weak. They covered the path in random directions, some going forward, some back, some crossing into the trees. It looked chaotic, like people had been moving through this area without control. As I kept walking, I noticed the ground changing again. The flat dirt slowly turned into soft patches of disturbed soil. The kind of soil you see when something has been dug up and filled again. Some of the patches were rectangular. Some were long and uneven. I didn't want to think about them, but it became impossible to ignore how unnatural they looked. The forest around me seemed to press down on me, making every breath tighter. The air felt wrong too. Heavy, humid, but not hot. I wiped my face and my hand came back with a thin layer of dirt like dust had settled on me just from walking. I didn't like that feeling. I wanted to turn back, but something in me kept pushing forward. Maybe the fear of going back through the same strange path. Maybe hope that the trail would loop around and take me somewhere safer. Then I heard movement. Not an animal sound. Not the soft scamper of a squirrel or the rustle of a bird. It sounded like weight shifting between branches, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. Slow, heavy steps, too controlled to be random wildlife. I stopped walking and just listened. The steps stopped when I stopped. That small detail hit me hard. I started walking again, trying to keep my pace steady. A moment later, the steps picked up again, matching my speed. I didn't look back. I felt the hair on my arms lift. My chest tightened. I kept my eyes on the path, focusing on every step, trying not to trip, trying not to show panic even though it was growing fast inside me. The footprints on the ground became fresher as I continued, and I saw more torn items. A shoelace, a broken flashlight, part of a jacket tangled on a thorn bush. The forest grew darker even though it was only midday. I could feel I wasn't alone, not even for a second. I walked faster. The sound behind me grew faster too. The trail finally opened into a small clearing, a shallow bowl-shaped dip in the earth. In the center was a single tree stump, old and wide, with deep marks carved into the top as if someone had hacked at it repeatedly. The ground around it looked disturbed, the same way those dug-up patches had looked earlier. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't want to stay there, so I moved through the clearing as quickly as I could, heading toward the line of trees on the opposite side. My legs were shaking, and I could hear the breathing behind me now. Slow, heavy, too controlled, too close. Something snapped loudly behind me, like a thick branch breaking under a heavy step. I didn't look back. I broke into a full run. The forest became a blur of dark shapes and sharp branches hitting my arms and legs. My breath came out in painful bursts. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to go somewhere that wasn't there. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, matching my pace, pushing closer with every second. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. I didn't dare stop until I saw sunlight again, thin and weak but real. I burst out of the trees and almost fell into a dry riverbed. The sound behind me stopped the moment I reached open ground. I kept running anyway, scrambling up the opposite bank, slipping on loose rocks, clawing at anything I could grab. When I reached the top, I finally turned around. The forest line below me was still, completely still. Nothing moved, nothing followed, but I felt watched. Even from that distance, I felt eyes inside the tree line. I didn't go back to the trail. I walked the long way around, following the dry riverbed until I found a road far from where I had entered. I kept checking behind me every few steps, expecting to see someone step out into the open, but no one did. When I reached my car, my shirt was soaked with sweat and dirt. My legs were covered in scratches. I locked the doors the second I got inside, even though no one was around. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the keys in the ignition. The ending became clear to me the moment I drove away. Whatever was in those woods wasn't something supernatural or mystical. It was something real, something human, something that lived or hid out there. Someone who watched those paths, followed people, collected the things they dropped, walked barefoot in the mud, dug into the ground for reasons I didn't want to imagine. I never found out who it was. I never went back to check. The trail wasn't on any official map after that day, as if it had never existed. But I still remember the sound of those footsteps matching mine, the breathing behind me, the shape I never saw, and the way the forest seemed to swallow every sign of what was out there. The clear truth is simple. I got lucky. I left those woods before whoever was following me decided to step out from the trees. And I know without any doubt that if I had slowed down for even a second, I would not have walked out at all. I didn't plan anything special for that hike. I just wanted a quiet day alone in the hills, something simple to clear my head. I picked a random trail on the map, one I had never tried before, a thin line cutting through a wide stretch of forest that didn't seem very popular. The air felt cool when I stepped out of the car, and for a moment everything looked normal, harmless, and calm. I didn't know how long I would be walking, but I figured I had enough daylight and enough energy for a long, slow trek. The trail started easy. The ground felt soft under my shoes, covered with damp brown leaves that stuck to the soles. The trees were tall and thin, the kind that sway with the smallest push of wind. The smell of earth was strong, like the forest had been soaked recently. I moved deeper and deeper, watching how the light between the branches shifted from warm to dim. I liked that silence, the kind where I could hear my own breathing and the small crack of twigs under my feet. For a while, it felt peaceful, but the deeper I went, the more the space around me changed. The trees grew closer together. The trail narrowed until it looked more like an animal path than a human one. I kept going because I didn't want to turn back so early. After another hour, the the ground started to slope downward. I could feel the temperature drop step by step. My arms and neck felt cold even though I was moving. I noticed small things first, tiny details that didn't feel important at the time. A torn backpack strap hanging from a branch, faded and sun-bleached. Fresh dirt piled in a way that didn't seem natural, with marks on the sides like something had been dragged. A piece of cloth stuck between rocks. Everything looked old, but not too old. Like someone had passed through recently but not long ago. By then, I hadn't seen another hiker. I realized I hadn't heard birds for a while either. The quiet became heavy, the kind that makes you too aware of your own presence. My footsteps sounded too loud, too sharp in the empty air. I slowed down without meaning to, walking softer, almost careful, like I didn't want the forest to hear me. The trail eventually leveled out into a long, narrow stretch of flat ground between two ridges. The space felt strange. The trees on both sides leaned inward as if they were closing over the path. I kept looking up, watching them bend in unnatural angles, shapes that made my stomach tighten. Then I noticed something else, footprints. Not just one set, but many, overlapping each other. At first I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape was human. Bare feet, dozens of them. Some small, some large, some deep in the mud as if the person had been running or stumbling. I froze. The prints looked recent. The moisture on their edges hadn't dried yet. I told myself someone probably walked here earlier, maybe a group that liked barefoot hiking or something unusual but harmless. But the sheer number of them made the explanation feel weak. They covered the path in random directions, some going forward, some back, some crossing into the trees. It looked chaotic, like people had been moving through this area without control. As I kept walking, I noticed the ground changing again. The flat dirt slowly turned into soft patches of disturbed soil. The kind of soil you see when something has been dug up and filled again. Some of the patches were rectangular. Some were long and uneven. I didn't want to think about them, but it became impossible to ignore how unnatural they looked. The forest around me seemed to press down on me, making every breath tighter. The air felt wrong too. Heavy, humid, but not hot. I wiped my face and my hand came back with a thin layer of dirt like dust had settled on me just from walking. I didn't like that feeling. I wanted to turn back, but something in me kept pushing forward. Maybe the fear of going back through the same strange path. Maybe hope that the trail would loop around and take me somewhere safer. Then I heard movement. Not an animal sound. Not the soft scamper of a squirrel or the rustle of a bird. It sounded like weight shifting between branches, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. Slow, heavy steps, too controlled to be random wildlife. I stopped walking and just listened. The steps stopped when I stopped. That small detail hit me hard. I started walking again, trying to keep my pace steady. A moment later, the steps picked up again, matching my speed. I didn't look back. I felt the hair on my arms lift. My chest tightened. I kept my eyes on the path, focusing on every step, trying not to trip, trying not to show panic even though it was growing fast inside me. The footprints on the ground became fresher as I continued, and I saw more torn items. A shoelace, a broken flashlight, part of a jacket tangled on a thorn bush. The forest grew darker even though it was only midday. I could feel I wasn't alone, not even for a second. I walked faster. The sound behind me grew faster too. The trail finally opened into a small clearing, a shallow bowl-shaped dip in the earth. In the center was a single tree stump, old and wide, with deep marks carved into the top as if someone had hacked at it repeatedly. The ground around it looked disturbed, the same way those dug-up patches had looked earlier. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't want to stay there, so I moved through the clearing as quickly as I could, heading toward the line of trees on the opposite side. My legs were shaking, and I could hear the breathing behind me now. Slow, heavy, too controlled, too close. Something snapped loudly behind me, like a thick branch breaking under a heavy step. I didn't look back. I broke into a full run. The forest became a blur of dark shapes and sharp branches hitting my arms and legs. My breath came out in painful bursts. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to go somewhere that wasn't there. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, matching my pace, pushing closer with every second. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. I didn't dare stop until I saw sunlight again, thin and weak but real. I burst out of the trees and almost fell into a dry riverbed. The sound behind me stopped the moment I reached open ground. I kept running anyway, scrambling up the opposite bank, slipping on loose rocks, clawing at anything I could grab. When I reached the top, I finally turned around. The forest line below me was still, completely still. Nothing moved, nothing followed, but I felt watched. Even from that distance, I felt eyes inside the tree line. I didn't go back to the trail. I walked the long way around, following the dry riverbed until I found a road far from where I had entered. I kept checking behind me every few steps, expecting to see someone step out into the open, but no one did. When I reached my car, my shirt was soaked with sweat and dirt. My legs were covered in scratches. I locked the doors the second I got inside, even though no one was around. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the keys in the ignition. The ending became clear to me the moment I drove away. Whatever was in those woods wasn't something supernatural or mystical. It was something real, something human, something that lived or hid out there. Someone who watched those paths, followed people, collected the things they dropped, walked barefoot in the mud, dug into the ground for reasons I didn't want to imagine. I never found out who it was. I never went back to check. The trail wasn't on any official map after that day, as if it had never existed. But I still remember the sound of those footsteps matching mine, the breathing behind me, the shape I never saw, and the way the forest seemed to swallow every sign of what was out there. The clear truth is simple. I got lucky. I left those woods before whoever was following me decided to step out from the trees. And I know without any doubt that if I had slowed down for even a second, I would not have walked out at all.